Viator in Terra brings the latest scholarship in medieval times to a general audience. Popular consciousness is rife with misconceptions and myths about medieval times, owing to inertia in the school system, peer education, or just plain laziness. However, our mission needs time and effort to bring about. We have great passion towards this interesting and often misunderstood time period. Please see the description below for ways where you can give even the smallest support. From the 12th to the 18th century, governmental authority grew continuously. The process was understood by all who saw it happening. It stirred them to incessant protest and to violent reaction. In later times, its growth has continued at an accelerated pace, and its extension has brought a corresponding extension of war. And now we no longer understand the process, we no longer protest, we no longer react. This quiescence of ours is a new thing, for which power has to thank the smoke screen in which it has wrapped itself. Formerly it could be seen, manifest in the person of the king, who did not disclaim being the master he was, and in whom human passions were discernible. Now, masked in anonymity, it claims to have no existence of its own, and to be but the impersonal and passionless instrument of the general will. From Bertrand de Juvenal, on power. Medieval civilization came of age in thunderous events on the 12th century's eve. The Norman Conquest of 1066, the Investiture Controversy, the fall of Toledo in 1085, the First Crusade, the murder of Charles the Good of Flanders, and countless lesser convulsions of faith and force. Portents and spectacles accompanied them. Halley's Comet before the Norman invasion, the German king prostrate before the Pope, fighting men renouncing riches on pilgrimage and crusade. These were larger than life. They summoned valor and wonder. Valor minted reputations and chronicles, wonder cast destinies for Christendom. Heroism became the pursuit of the powerful and the awe of the many. These were spectacles of power and faith, but beneath them lay a deeper transformation, the reorganization of authority itself. Charlemagne's old liturgy of power, gestures, oaths, and rituals that once bound a Christian empire had dissolved with his line. Habits survived, though, and were replicated piecemeal by counts, bishops, and castellans who translated imperial coordination into local templates. What had been choreography for a wide realm became routines for narrower jurisdictions. By the 11th century, men of violence had learned to speak the language of legitimacy. They called themselves lords, and their command of force became a credential of nobility. The right to fight, to punish, to levy dues or tolls that was once tied to public office was now treated as property. The empire's moral grammar hardened into a cage of norms, rituals of homage, inherited titles, banal obligations, and an invisible web of expectations that fixed communities in place. Meanwhile, Europe's social fabric thickened. Populations grew, clearances, mills, and markets multiplied. Silver and gold coursed through monastic and urban hands. With growth came complexity and friction, symbolic and customary coordinations that sufficed for a sparse countryside, strained under the weight of transactions, disputes, and ambitions. Under this pressure, the Carolingian inheritance cracked. Customs that once conferred legitimacy now constrained adaptation. Violence, once ritualized, leaked into daily competition. This was the crisis of the 12th century, a structural convulsion born of success. Demographic and economic expansion had outpaced the processing capacity of oath, kinship, and ritual. Local lords, pressed by rivals and subjects, overused coercion, because that was what the old toolkit had on hand. Kings and bishops, alarmed by disorder, reached for new techniques of coordination, peace ordinances, written procedure, fiscal audit, and office. These were attempts to compress information and standardize behavior so that a thicker society could be administered at all. The paradox of this age is that growth produced crisis, and crisis produced administrative habit. The 12th century's renaissance in learning, law, and urban life was shadowed by new routines of extraction and by power that increasingly hid behind paperwork. An anonymized authority would take its place, with ledger and file replacing oaths and rights, all with different frictions and different blind spots. There were casualties among the peasantry, the dispossessed, the unheard. But the impasse was also the lords. Their inability to reconcile inherited norms with expanding social complexity tore apart the world they helped make. Their anxiety, their experiments in control, their violent self-assertion all point toward a single question. How can power organize itself when its own habits become obstacles? We shall follow that question's resolution from the Carolingian liturgy of power, through its fragmentation and mutation into local routines, then the legal fiscal formats devised to manage the overflow. What begins as the story of ritual ends as the story of administrative form. How rule hardened into systems that managed complexity while masking themselves in impersonal neutrality. At the heart of Carolingian society stood the idea that order could be imagined, enacted, and sustained not just through force, but through a shared grammar of ritual, symbol, and sacred time. This was not a world of anonymous bureaucracy, instead one where ceremonies and assemblies, relics and processions, gospel books and royal charters all propped up a culture of symbolic communication, a liturgization of power. The Eastern Roman Empire had given Charlemagne's upstart imperial ambitions a model for imperial organization and economic political theory. A symbolic organization of consensus allowed Europe's new masters, the Carolingians, to achieve coordination among local elites without mass organization or administration. These new emperors had turned power into liturgy. The same signs and symbols prevailed across Europe, all without too strong a central power. Local elites held sway in the countryside with imperial assent by adhering to these signs and symbols. And I quote, Carolingian society really did lean heavily on symbolic communication, and moreover that it did so more than had Frankish society hitherto. The intensification of interest in gifts, violence, and orchestrated behavior documented through, but also by, our evidence suggests that all this cannot be dismissed as a trick of the sources, and that some historical process was at work. That does not mean we have to claim that there was more gift-giving, violence, or formal ceremony in the 9th century than earlier. For if that is not altogether implausible, it is certainly immeasurable. We can, however, state that these forms took on a greater prominence in the coordination of social activity, and became the objects of greater scrutiny at a variety of levels, from Charles West, reframing the feudal revolution, political and social transformation between Marne and Moselle. At the heart of this system was the notion that power, far from being strictly bureaucratic or rational legal, was performed and enacted in ceremony, displayed in courts and councils, and granted divine sanction through ecclesiastical rites. West frames this process as a fundamental formalization of social interaction, wherein older practices of kinship, loyalty, and local negotiation were embedded into a more coherent cultural repertoire. The Carolingian order rested on institutions that organized social cooperation across an empire without a bureaucracy. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, mechanisms of agrarian production, ecclesiastical management, and royal authority formed an interdependent system of governance. These institutions emerged not from abstract design, but from practical responses to the needs of movement, supply, and legitimacy, feeding armies, sustaining monasteries, provisioning itinerant courts, and translating authority into writing. The empire's cohesion derived from its ability to convert relationships into records. Through charters, polyptychs, and praecarii, local transactions became components of imperial governance. The villa, royal, monastic, or aristocratic, was the basic cell of this order, a bipartite estate of domain and dependent holdings that linked production to the moral and fiscal authority of kings and bishops. Documents such as the Capitulae de Villae and the Brevium Exemplar from Anaps reveal a managerial culture that sought to rationalize resources and provisioning rather than legislate universal norms. Complementing this agrarian structure was a monetary and fiscal framework that sustained political cohesion through uniformity. The silver penny, standardized mints, and regulated markets projected the empire's prestige more than its coercive power. As Verhulst observed, monetary unity and the supervision of tolls were instruments of credibility, imperial order expressed through circulation. The church provided the administrative backbone. Monasteries and bishoprics acted as archives, fiscal depots, and logistical centers. Their estate surveys defined tenures and obligations with a precision unmatched by secular government. As Hummer and West demonstrate, episcopal households along the Rhine and Moselle often equaled or surpassed comital offices in wealth and coordination, embodying the overlap of spiritual and temporal authority. Royal power, in turn, functioned through consent and reciprocity. Inns shows that the fisc was not a fixed domain, but a network of benefices and praecarii held under oath and service. Governance operated through assemblies, charters, and prayers that rendered political order legible across linguistic and regional divides. The result was an empire capable of integration without centralization, which lived in a negotiated order that linked the productive countryside to Christian kingship through record, ritual, and custom. Its durability lay in institutional elasticity. When dynastic unity failed, its local articulations in monasteries, estates, and courts endured. Later European fiscal and administrative systems would evolve from this template, reinterpreting the Carolingian logic of coordination without bureaucracy. Carolingian society was agrarian to its core, yet it cannot be reduced to the image of dependent peasants laboring under lordly rule. Archaeological, documentary, and charter evidence reveal a countryside whose cohesion rested on freeholding families and communal regulation, rather than on servile dependence. The ingenuus, the freeholder, occupied the most important social stratum. Neither noble nor unfree, he and his household were the operating unit of rural production, taxation, and defense. And I quote, "Beyond the courtiers, servants, clients, and soldiers, there were many other free and noble subordinates and subjects of kings, and other great lords, whose relations with their lords were always territorial insofar as power over people involved a measure of control over the land they occupied. As I shall hope to show, however, the relations of most lords or rulers and their free subjects were not, at least before the age of professional law, seen in terms of a land nexus. The relation in which most nobles and free men stood to their rulers was not that of fiefholders, but of subjects. Any of them, like all the courtiers, servants, and retainers, might have to take oaths to their lords at various times and undergo ceremonies to symbolize their subordination or their receipt of office or favors. Whether or not the ceremonies were similar, the relations to the ruler of all these different kinds of subject differed. Quite apart from their relations with their lords, they also all had other relations with other individuals, and above all with groups. Their families and kinsmen, their neighbors, and their colleagues and fellows in work and sociability. They were members of local communities as much as they were vassals of local lords, and they were subjects of kingdoms as much as they were of kings. From Susan Reynolds, Fiefs and Vassals, the medieval evidence reinterpreted. Throughout the Carolingian heartlands, from Neustria and the Loire Valley to Alemannia and Bavaria, freeholders composed the bulk of the rural population. The surviving polyptychs record an abundance of liberi homines, free men, holding full or partial mansi, contrasted with the smaller proportion of servi or liti. Verhulst's synthesis of estate evidence demonstrates that free peasants, cultivating small to medium holdings, produced most of the food consumed by local and monastic markets. They operated within the economic orbit of the great villi, but were not bound to them as serfs. They were taxpayers, oath-swearers, and militiamen. And I quote, "The Carolingian state, particularly its military organization, was in principle based upon the existence of a large class of free people, mainly peasants. Gifts of landed property to churches, especially in the 8th and 9th centuries, were often made by free people who ran a peasant farm, sometimes with the help of unfree servants, mancipia. Peasants might have enjoyed rights in the woods, pastures, and other uncultivated land belonging to the community whose members they were. The location and composition of this community is a problem, for its relation to the population center of an organized big estate is not at all clear. Often, independent peasant farms were located near or even in the midst of royal or ecclesiastical manors. From Adrian Verhulst, The Carolingian Economy. These free cultivators enjoyed real though limited autonomy. They managed crop rotation, organized pasture use, and maintained tools and livestock collectively. Even freeholders owed obligations, whether in labor, in produce, or in deference. Local mayors governed village affairs with the lord's consent, often blurring lines between autonomy and oversight. This autonomy thus did not imply isolation, for local farmers still owed dues or services to royal or ecclesiastical lords, especially for the use of milling facilities, salt works, or coin mints. They owed census, or annual renders of grain, honey, or silver to local lords or abbeys. These were acknowledgements of protection and tenure, not taxes imposed by an abstract state. What made them indispensable was their continuity. Family farms persisted across generations, giving the Carolingian countryside a demographic stability rare in post-Roman Europe. Property among freeholders was embedded in kinship. Inns shows that the transmission of land through families, by division, dowry, and sworn agreement, anchored social stability more securely than the patronage of lords. The mansi were hereditary but divisible, and disputes over inheritance filled local courts. Through such mechanisms, freeholders retained a tangible claim to both land and community membership. Village life operated through collective institutions that we would recognize, following Susan Reynolds, as communal publics. Assemblies, placeta, local courts and parishes that adjudicated disputes, organized repairs, and regulated resource use. These were not private associations of dependents, but small-scale republics, capable of acting in their own name. The Carolingian Malus, a court presided over by a count, but staffed by local scabini and witnesses, embodied this balance between royal oversight and community self-rule. The Carolingian monarchy relied on these communities for justice, taxation in kind, and recruitment. Charlemagne's capitularies repeatedly summoned liberi homines to provide military service and to attend public assemblies. The same freeholders who ploughed and tithed also bore arms, repaired bridges, and maintained the public roads. Their obligations were public in nature, conceived as duties to the res publica, a term that, as Reynolds stresses, persisted in both legal and moral language well beyond the empire's political unity. In Hummers, Alsace, and West's Moselle, free villages coordinated harvest labor, toll payments, and tithes through local elders mayors. These offices were not imposed hierarchies, but elective or customary roles that mediated between community and higher lordship. The bishop or abbot might confirm their acts, but the initiative remained local. The Carolingian countryside thus contained the rudiments of public governance at the smallest scale. Decisions made in assemblies, validated by custom, and enforceable through collective reputation. Dependence existed, but in gradations. Many freeholders entered commendation relationships for protection, justice, or patronage, without surrendering property. The praecaria, leases of church land to laymen for a fixed census, bound free cultivators into ecclesiastical networks while preserving their freedom. In these exchanges, the church gained loyal rent payers and defenders, while the freeholder gained secure tenure and spiritual benefit. Hummer and Verhulst both stress that such arrangements represented integration. The church depended on these free tenures to sustain its own fiscal base. Slavery, though still present, declined steadily across the 8th and 9th centuries. Former slaves were absorbed as rent-paying tenants, and new cultivators emerged in reclaimed lands and frontier clearances. The overall trajectory of the Carolingian demographic order was toward unfree labor, giving way to free tenure under obligation. A transformation made possible by the organizational reach of estates and monasteries, but driven by the self-reproduction of free households. Freeholding communities did not exist outside the structures of power, for they constituted the elementary public order on which royal and ecclesiastical authority relied. In Reynolds's sense, they were communal publics, bodies of men and women who collectively managed rights to fields, forests, and waters, and who recognized both divine and royal jurisdiction. Assemblies set grazing limits, distributed meadowlands, and organized collective offerings to saints. Their autonomy was practical rather than ideological, a way to ensure the functioning of daily life in a landscape with little permanent state presence. Royal authority acknowledged this autonomy. The Capitulaire de Villiers and the Capitularies of Louis, the pious presupposed that local communities were competent to manage themselves, provided they remained within the moral order of Christendom and rendered their due to lords and church. The Carolingian res publica was thus articulated through thousands of micro-republics of practice, freeholders and neighbors governing themselves while upholding the universal frame of Christian kingship. Carolingian Europe was not an urban civilization in the classical sense, yet it possessed an intricate network of towns, markets, and itinerant fairs that connected the agrarian base to the political and spiritual centers of power. These were not autonomous city-states, yet remained nodal points of exchange and administration, whose rhythm followed both economic demand and ecclesiastical or royal oversight. Scholarship portrays this landscape as a system of regulated circulation, an infrastructure of movement as essential to Carolingian governance as estates and churches. The Carolingian town comprised the fortified seat of a count or bishop, a cathedral or abbey precinct, and a surrounding marketplace where artisans, traders, and peasants congregated. Verhulst describes the early medieval town as a continuum between villa, market, and palace. Centers like Aachen, Metz, Reims, and Lyon contained palatial, episcopal, and mercantile quarters fused together by common logistical functions like storing, minting, and distributing goods. Archaeological evidence from Dorstad, Quentovic, and Pavia shows that such emporia, often laying by rivers, served as controlled corridors of commerce. They were supervised environments where tolls, weights, and coinage were standardized. Royal intervention ensured both fiscal income and political visibility. Markets embodied the sovereign's peace, and to violate it was an act against the public order. The Carolingian regime's most tangible contribution to commerce was its creation of a monetary and juridical framework for exchange. Charlemagne's monetary reform of the late 8th century standardized the silver denarius, establishing a ratio of 12 denarii to the solidus and 20 solidi to the pound. This reform, described by Verhulst as a monetary unification unprecedented since late antiquity, permitted regional trade to function on consistent terms. Markets themselves were legally defined institutions. Capitularies like the Capitulaire de Villiers, and later King Charles the Bald's Edict of Pitters, prohibited unauthorized markets and required royal or episcopal approval for new ones. These measures, Innes notes, were less about suppressing exchange than about ensuring traceability and moral legitimacy. That buying and selling occurred under public witness, with fair weights and lawful coin. The result was not laissez-faire commerce, but a moral economy where circulation was a reflection of divine and royal order. Merchants in this world were often mobile specialists tied to ecclesiastical or royal institutions. Hummer's analysis of Alsace highlights how monasteries managed surplus and long-distance trade through lay agents who combined devotional and commercial functions. These negotiators operated under the legal protection of their patrons, conducting exchange between estate centers and market towns. At the same time, local exchange thrived in the shadow of parish churches and villa gates. Peasants sold small surpluses of grain, cheese, honey, or textiles at weekly gatherings. Rents were often commuted to money payments at these same venues. This integration of local markets into estate management made trade a continuation of agrarian accounting. Every market day reaffirmed the reciprocal ties between producers, lords, and the church. The Carolingian Empire maintained a network of annual and seasonal fairs that paralleled liturgical calendars. Many were attached to saints' feasts or relic translations, which gave them religious legitimacy and drew pilgrims and traders simultaneously. Verhulst identifies these as proto-institutionalized events, hybrid spaces where devotion and commerce overlapped. In ports like Dorstad and river junctions like Verdun, the fairs facilitated the export of wine, salt, and slaves towards Scandinavia, the Rhineland, and Italy, and the import of furs, glassware, and luxury textiles. The circulation of goods was episodic but wide-ranging, demonstrating that Carolingian Europe was neither autarkic nor static. West studies of the Moselle region show that episcopal centers acted as both sponsors and regulators of these exchanges, ensuring that commercial mobility remained compatible with the moral geography of Christendom. Even where markets flourished, the urban population remained small, often numbering only a few hundred. Yet these communities were not mere service appendages to lords or bishops. The townspeople of craftsmen, merchants, and clergy formed associations and fraternities that handled policing, maintenance, and charitable functions. The Carolingian town thus housed incipient communes long before municipal charters formalized them. These were local publics whose legitimacy derived from consensus and custom rather than delegation from above. The overlap of religious, economic, and political activity created a civic culture rooted in cooperation. Fairs coincided with feast days, market courts with episcopal chapters, and tolls with tithes. Urban space became the meeting ground of the res publica in miniature as a moralized, transactional public sphere where the ideals of Christian order and the realities of exchange converged. Carolingian towns, markets, and fairs thus serve as the empire's infrastructural network of socio-political cohesion. Far from peripheral, they were central to how the empire coordinated production, circulation, and legitimacy without an extensive bureaucracy. Each market cross and coin die materialized the same logic that animated Carolingian governance at large. Coordination through ritualized consent, supervision, and standardization rather than coercion. These institutions linked the fields to the altar and the altar to the road, embedding commerce within the moral fabric of the Christian empire. The Carolingian monarchy governed over an empire without a centralized tax system, yet it developed a coherent framework of agrarian management and fiscal coordination that sustained royal mobility, military campaigns, and ecclesiastical patronage. Rather than extract surplus through impersonal taxation, Carolingian rulers organized production and redistribution through estate management, monetization, and negotiated obligations. These tools reflected both Roman inheritance and Christian moral economy. Carolingian economic policy saw short, targeted interventions in provisioning and prices, systematic work on coinage and mint control, licensing and policing of markets and tolls, and continuous exploitation and reshuffling of royal and ecclesiastical landed resources. The court's capacity to coordinate rested less on a tax state than on literate management of estates, money, and access to circulation, with the church providing most of the durable administrative scaffolding. Royal estates, the fisc, and great ecclesiastical villi were organized to provision an itinerant kingship. The brevium exemplar, A short inventory of the royal estate at Anaps near Lille, written around the year 800, offers a rare window into the material and administrative infrastructure that sustained Carolingian kingship. It exemplifies how the fiscus functioned not merely as a landed domain, but as a logistical organism designed to supply a peripatetic court and to redistribute resources across a scattered empire. The text lists with remarkable precision the estate's buildings and productive assets: a stone hall for the lord's residence, kitchens and storerooms for food preparation, barns and granaries for grain and hay, enclosed yards for livestock, and workshops for crafts. The density and specialization of these facilities reveal that royal estates served multifunctional roles combining residence, storage, and manufacture. Their layout: granaries adjacent to kitchens, cellars for beer and wine, forges for tools, was scaled to support periodic royal visits and to function as distribution depots for neighboring dependencies. Verhulst explains the brevium exemplar as a template of estate management rather than a unique record. Its enumerative method, aggregating heads of livestock, listing dependent households, and identifying parcels of cultivated land, was designed to make agrarian production legible to administrators who could not directly observe it. This legibility allowed itinerant kings to govern provisioning flows without maintaining permanent fiscal offices. The written inventory substituted for presence. What was recorded could be verified, reassigned, or audited through intermediaries. The distinction between brevium, short summaries or inventories, and polyptychs, comprehensive estate surveys, is crucial. A breve offered an overview, totals of land, tenants, and produce, sufficient for fiscal planning and provisioning. The polyptych, in contrast, descended into detail: the names and dues of each tenant, the obligations in labor or rent, and the exact proportions owed to lord and church. Together, they formed a two-tiered documentary system. The breve captured aggregate wealth, while the polyptych operationalized it into actionable obligations. Verhulst regards this as one of the most sophisticated administrative distinctions of the Carolingian world, a method that translated local economies into units of royal governance without direct taxation. Another document, the Capitulaire de Villiers, is best read as a crisis manual rather than a general agrarian policy. Issued under the impression of recent dearths, it bundles practical measures like religious observances, poor relief, protection of estate familiae, stock preservation, limits on speculative hoarding, and maximum prices for grain and bread. These ad hoc instructions serve to keep flows moving and quell abuse. The Capitulaire also outlines responsibilities for vilici, estate managers, and eudices, royal agents, creating a chain of accountability meant to keep the provisioning apparatus functional. Charlemagne's interest lay less in dictating agricultural technique than in disciplining the logistics of abundance, ensuring that royal domains supplied his itinerant court and armies without allowing local officers to enrich themselves or neglect charity. By specifying the handling of tools, livestock, orchards, wine, and wool, the text reflects the administrative imagination of a ruler without a bureaucracy. Its measures presuppose the literacy of the monastery and the vigilance of the royal steward as substitutes for direct state control. Finally, the Capitulaire ties economic management to moral and theological order. Failure of crops is construed as divine correction. Proper management, almsgiving, and liturgical discipline are its remedy. The king's obligation is not to intervene as an economic sovereign, but to restore cosmic balance through correct governance. The Carolingian Empire's capacity to coordinate production and mobilize resources rested on money, markets, and the church's fiscal apparatus. Without a standing tax system or permanent bureaucracy, imperial governance relied on standardized coinage, controlled exchange, and the economic reach of ecclesiastical institutions. These tools together formed the empire's fiscal constitution, a distributed, literate economy that could support armies, courts, and monasteries, while projecting royal authority through the mechanisms of accounting and consent. From the reforms of Pippin to the reigns of Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, monetary policy, was the most continuous and deliberate of all Carolingian interventions. Charters and capitularies pursued the stabilization of the silver penny, ensuring that all coinage conformed to a single weight standard, 12 denarii to the solidus, 20 solidi to the pound. The intent was not fiscal profit, but political coherence. Uniform coinage served in this way as a visible expression of empire, a public sign that imperial order extended from Aachen to Lombardy. Recoinages under Louis the Pious in 814, 818, and 822. 823 enforced this standard by withdrawing adulterated pieces and reaffirming royal control over mints. Counterfeiting and the circulation of new coins without royal approval were harshly penalized. Coins of uncertain origin could be accepted only by weight. Charlemagne's edict of 794 at Frankfurt linked these measures to market conduct by setting maximum prices for exchange and confirming royal oversight of money's moral integrity. Despite attempts to centralize minting, culminating in Charles the Bald's Edict of Pitters in 864, which reduced the number of operational mints, the system remained regionally diverse. Major centers such as Mel, Dorstad, and Regensburg continued to strike pennies and obols under royal license. The important outcome was not administrative uniformity, but functional reliability, a single monetary language that made tolls, rents, and trade mutually intelligible across ethnic and legal frontiers. The Carolingian coin thus fused economic and symbolic power as a medium of calculation, exchange, and identity. Just as money unified value, markets unified circulation. Royal policy defined where and how exchange could occur, balancing moral oversight with practical control. Kings legalized markets by chartering or confirming them under the peace of the realm. Unauthorized markets were declared null and subject to confiscation. The Capitulaire de Villiers required that transactions occur under public supervision with fair weights and measures. Toll regulation followed the same principle. The Capitulary of Thionville 805 prohibited new and unjust tolls, pruning private exactions that multiplied along river routes. At the same time, the monarchy tightened supervision at key emporia, royal ports like Quentovic on the Channel, Dorstad on the Rhine, and later Rouen, where tolls were standardized, often at 10% of declared value. These were staffed by procurators and praefecti emporiae, officials who embodied royal presence in commerce. The Raffelstetten Inquiry of the early 10th century, a direct successor to Carolingian policy, formalized differentiated tariffs for Danubian trade, illustrating how fiscal thinking had matured into regulated corridors of exchange. In these controlled spaces, commerce became an extension of public order. Markets were not expressions of private enterprise, but of royal peace. To buy or sell outside them was to deny the king's justice. The most substantial flow of revenue in the Carolingian system came not from taxation, but from ecclesiastical land management. Monasteries and bishoprics were the empire's de facto treasury, literate, locally embedded, and capable of systematic accounting. Under Charlemagne, the precarial census, an annual rent paid for the use or precaria of church land, was standardized and expanded. Hummer's work on Alsace shows how these payments were fixed in money or kind, typically 1 to 3 solidi per mansus, and scheduled on uniform rent days. This alignment of spiritual and fiscal rhythms bound monasteries to royal provisioning. Councils of the 780s, 820s record repeated petitions for royal protection of church property, precisely because kings habitually drew from this reservoir to supply armies and itinerant courts. As West notes for the Moselle and Reims region, monastic complexes such as Prüm, Avenay, and Saint-Wandrille controlled thousands of mansi and hundreds of dependent households, making them fiscal engines of the empire. The density of these ecclesiastical estates provided an administrative network more durable than any comital office. The precarial census thus served a dual function. It regularized the church's internal economy and provided the king a flexible instrument of resource mobilization. It transformed the monastery's moral wealth into liquidity, linking piety to provisioning. The Carolingian fisc, the collection of royal domains and rights, was not a static public treasury, but a fluid system of claims. Its boundaries shifted constantly through donation, exchange, confiscation, and restoration. Charters and annals record the king alienating land to reward service, only to recall it later to restore the fisc. As West and Inns both stress, this fiscal elasticity was intrinsic to how the empire balanced generosity and control. Lay magnates held much of their property as benefices or precariae, enjoying usufruct under conditions of service. Rather than alienating control, this arrangement multiplied participation in the public economy. Royal land fed private lords who in turn maintained military and administrative functions. The king's gift economy was therefore not an abdication of revenue, but a strategy of distributed governance. Politically, the court concentrated legitimacy and arbitration, manifest in new palaces at Ingelheim and Frankfurt, while the routine extraction of rent and labor remained in the hands of bishops and abbots. The estate-church nexus became the fiscal heart of Carolingian order, a partnership that rendered public order visible without permanent bureaucracy. The resulting system was remarkably effective within its limits. Money was standardized but not taxed. Markets were free only within the law. Finally, the church was autonomous yet inseparable from the state. Fiscal and monetary financing under the Carolingians thus formed a coherent, if decentralized, architecture of coordination, a Christian economy of trust, record, and reciprocity that bound land, silver, and salvation into a single logic of governance. Carolingian military power ran through summons, status, and institutions, not through a neat rule tying service to land. As Inns puts it, the Frankish army was never a universal peasant militia, and military service was not an incident of land tenure before the 11th century. Obligation was defined by who could fight when called, while those who did not fight supported those who did through the Heroism, an army tax, routinely levied. The crown's capacity to move and supply forces rested on estate and church-centered logistics rather than a tax bureaucracy. Inventories and polyptics made resources legible. Royal and monastic villi provisioned the itinerant court and campaigns. Crisis ordinances like the Capitulae de Villis and Brevium Exemplar codified how to keep grain, stock, and labor flowing. Roads, bridges, and messenger services were framed as public functions enforced under the ban, while ecclesiastical patrimonies furnished carts, food, men, and money along royal routes. What followed was a mobilization system that combined record, summons, and provisioning into a workable war footing. Mobilization was elite-led, estate-fed, and only lightly fiscal, but remarkably effective within its limits. Carolingian mobilization rested on status, summons, and institutional nodes rather than a rule tying service to landholding. Inns is explicit, and I quote, "Once we accept that the Frankish army was never a universal peasant militia, and that military service was not an incident of land tenure before the 11th century, the inevitable question arises. How was military service defined before the emergence of proprietorial lordship in the 11th century? Examination of the dues exacted from those who did not fight to support those who did supplies an answer. In the Carolingian period, there is clear evidence for an army tax, the Heroism. This is a facet of the Carolingian military system which has been hitherto neglected, but it sheds important light upon the nature of the obligation to fight. The received view is that the Heroism was an ancient fine for non-performance of the military service. Certainly Gundhart, Abbot Hraben's client, wished to pay it as an alternative to fighting, and much Carolingian legislation concerns comparable cases. However, it is equally clear that by the Carolingian period, the Heroism was levied as a matter of course from some individuals. It was not simply a fine for non-performance, but a payment in support of the army. The polyptic evidence makes it crystal clear that for many men payment of the Heroism was a levy to support the army, not a fine for not fighting. From Matthew Inns, State and Society in the early Middle Ages, the Middle Rhine Valley. Claims of universal obligation appear in 9th century capitularies, chiefly in defensive emergencies. Their very promulgation shows that such universality was exceptional, not the baseline. The fighting corps arose from local elites, whether magnates of the realm, comital retinues, or ecclesiastical clients, who kept training and thus generated the mechanisms for the martial engine. And I quote, "Criteria of ability must have been the bottom line in determining the makeup of the Carolingian army. A free peasant was no use in the field unless equipped and trained." Abbot Hrabban of Fulda, adapting a Roman commentator on military organization for a Carolingian king, commented that, "In our days, youths are nourished in the houses of princes. The sons of the highest aristocracy learn the arts of hunting, riding, and fighting in a period at court in their adolescence. Those of a less exalted status spent a similar training period in the households of aristocratic patrons. Here was the supply of trained soldiers which fueled the Carolingian military machine. To receive such a placement, one needed wealth and connections. From Matthew Innes, State and Society in the early Middle Ages, the Middle Rhine Valley. Those without the connections for military training contributed logistics. Charlemagne demanded carts and provisions from abbots. The Wissembourg Polyptych shows how an abbey organized its estates as a composite levy, free tenants supplying horses, oxen, carts, and occasionally serving in person, with obligations calibrated estate by estate. The record there could muster 8 cavalry horses, 36 oxen, 8 carts, and 20 men in the field every year, a neatly rounded contingent built from coordinated holdings. Obligations varied even on royal land. In the Middle Rhine, some royal settlements like Nierstein and Willewillier required personal service from free tenants, explicitly contrasted with neighboring places where such duty did not apply. Organization and provisioning rested with the immediate ruler, count or abbot, who assembled usable units from a patchwork of estates. Financial and in-kind support bridged the gap between fighters and non-fighters. Innes reconstructs the Haribanus as an army payment, routinely levied on free men from whom personal service was not expected, evidenced in polyptychs that note dues ad hostem, or one measure for the host, at Askermundisheim, while at Morgenstadt, 30 smaller or 24 larger measures were levied. Missi were instructed in 808 to verify that poorer men, paupers, had been grouped to furnish a soldier, and that those failing to support their peers paid the Haribanus. Taken together, the evidence shows a mobilization system built from elite networks and estate management, with logistics widely distributed and fiscal or commutational mechanisms supporting combatants. Universal rhetoric surfaces at moments of danger. Routine practice ties obligation to summons, capacity, and local organization. As discussed, Carolingian military liability was articulated by summons, not by tenure. Capitularies repeatedly tie penalties to specific royal orders. A man pays only if he was called and failed to appear or support his peers, underscoring that obligation was episodic and command-driven rather than a standing incident of landholding. Innes collates the measures. Fines for those ordered out in 810 who stayed back. In 811, payments due if summoned and absent, with lords themselves paying for men they purposely kept on guard at home. By 819, even bishops, abbots, counts, and royal vassals owed the Haribanus if they failed to fight without necessary cause. Parallel Italian items punish returners who left a campaign against orders. The common thread is a particular summons calling for a muster to arms, not a generalized legal burden. Within that framework, the Haribanus functioned as an army payment taken as a matter of course from those not expected to fight. Innes calls it an army tax, visible most clearly in estate surveys. At Askermundisheim in the Dreieck, free royal tenants rendered one measure for the host. At Morgenstadt to the west of Worms, free tenants paid 30 smaller or 24 larger measures in payment to the host. These dues clearly fell on free men from whom personal service was not anticipated. Capitularies also used the Haribanus to police collective responsibility. An ordinance of AD 808 instructed the missi to verify that the paupers had been bonded into soldier-providing groups as ordered the previous year. Anyone who failed to help his peer or payam suum in the host was to pay the Haribanus. That social design of grouping those below fighting capacity to equip a combatant fits the polyptic evidence and shows how fiscal burden substituted for personal service. Estate records make the menu of military-related dues unusually concrete. The St. Germain polyptic itemizes a 3-year cycle, 4 solidi for the host, then 2 solidi in lieu of delivering animals to the army, then 1 sheep with lamb for the herbage tax, alongside small renders for grazing or in pasture, woodcutting or lignariscia, transport or caratio, and assigned days of ploughing and handwork. Montierendea, meanwhile, saw tenants commonly owe a relatively high sum as substitution for military service, and I quote, "As on most other peasant farms of Montierenda, the few tenants were charged with light services, 3 times 3 days per year ploughing and other tillage work, aratura, corvada, beneficia, carriage and handwork, caropra et manopra. Here and elsewhere, mostly unlimited, 15 days of unspecified work on the domain, and 15 days in the abbey, transport service once a year, ambuscatio. Here unspecified, but generally to the market of Chalon-sur-Marne or Langers, 89 km away. The latter service could be bought off for 10 pennies. Firewood, lignaire had to be delivered, 1 to 5 cartloads per mansus, and wooden tiles, singly, here, and on average 100 per mansus. Hens 3 or 6 and eggs, 15 or 30 had to be given, and a relative high sum, 1 to 3 shillings had to be paid as substitution for military service. From Adrian Verhulst, The Carolingian Economy. Taken together, legal and manorial records show a 2-track system of fighters mobilized by named summons through elite channels, and non-fighters with predictable payments and in-kind contributions that sustain the host. The Haribanus and its companion dues stitched these tracks together, allowing the court to convert village resources into military capacity without redefining service as a universal, tenure-based duty. All the institutions traced above, estates and polyptics, coin and markets, monastic patrimonies, and the elastic fisc, worked in a realm that lacked a centralized bureaucracy and did not command a monopoly of violence. Coordination depended on practices that made power visible, comprehensible, and repeatable to people who lived far from the court and mostly among their neighbors. Charles West calls this package the liturgy of power. Assemblies convened at recognized places, oaths sworn and renewed, charters read aloud, copied and stored, seals, coins, and measures that carried the king's sign, a penance and blessing that folded correction into order, and gifts, hospitality, and itinerary that drew elites into the same circuit. These performances stitched center and locality together. Royal placeta and county courts produced decisions under witness lists. Missi and bishops carried admonitions outward and returned reports inward. Cartularies, inventories, and rent rolls translated speech into account. The same logic reached into exchange. Legal markets under public peace, toll stations with known tariffs, and a disciplined silver penny gave transactions a common language. None of this required permanent offices in every district. Authority traveled as text, right, and person, then settled into local routines that communities could enact with their own officers and elders. The liturgy worked because it synchronized expectations. Participants knew how an assembly should open and close, which words bound a pledge, which signs proved a grant, where and when buying counted as lawful, which rent day or census recognized tenure. Kings and bishops gained legibility and reach. Counts and abbots gained recognition and protection. Village publics gained predictable forums and scripts for judgment, provision, and appeal. Coercion remained possible, yet the ordinary functioning of rule rested on shared forms that produced consent, or at least reduced dispute to recognizable procedures. This institutional operating system, however, had limits. Meanings behind signs and symbols could be contested. Rival coalitions could stage competing rites. Records could be withheld or forged. Above all else, audiences could refuse to perform. The court answered by refining scripts, tightening coin and seal discipline, and multiplying occasions for witnessed agreement. Even so, the essence remained constant. Rule advanced through ritual and documentation that communities could reproduce without a standing bureaucracy, and that elites would accept because their status and revenues flowed through the same channels. 9th century actors lived amid noisy signals. Letters from figures like Lupus of Ferrières and Abbess Theuthild of Remiremont show elites floundering in a sea of unreliable report, gossip and hearsay, much of it orbiting the royal court. Symbolic communication in Francia was strikingly ambivalent, and just as striking was the energy spent contesting and narrowing that ambivalence. Contemporaries recognized this lack of like-mindedness and worked hard to close interpretive gaps. Writing and ritual worked together, not at cross purposes. Ordines for councils and royal ordinations were set down in the 9th century. The monastic divine office became a daily institutional meeting. Canon law manuscripts incorporated procedural scripts. The upshot is a sharpened interest in meetings as distinct, nameable, and formally run events. A program to give gatherings a textually anchored shape that reduced improvisation and dispute about what counted. The push to codify also flowed through capitularies and pastoral legislation. Hummer shows how Charlemagne's Admonitio Generalis in 789, alongside related measures, defined core tenets, mandated instruction, and catalyzed a wider circuitry of conciliar norms and vernacular catechesis through exhortations, creeds, and prayers that fixed a common grammar of duty. This moral program traveled along written channels linking court to locality, and I quote, "The Admonitio Generalis spelled out the fundamental tenets of the Christian faith and advised that all congregations be taught the Lord's Prayer and the Creed. Its promulgation and the conciliar legislation that followed in the decade after 800 energized pastoral activities throughout the empire, although the capitulary says nothing about the use of the vernacular for lay instruction. An old High German exhortation to the laity, dubbed the Exhortatio ad plebem Christianam, which bids its listeners to be familiar with the basic tenets and prayers of Christianity and to take responsibility for the religious instruction of their children, must have been a product of the pastoral efforts mobilized by the Admonitio and subsequent councils. Vestiges of the manuscript tradition suggest that the Exhortatio enjoyed a wide circulation in the East. The two surviving 9th century copies of the sermon were produced in Bavaria, probably at Regensburg and Niederaltaich, but made their way into the archives of Fulda and Freising, where they were preserved. From Hans Hummer, Politics and Power in Early Medieval Europe, Alsace and the Frankish realm, jurists and bishops too tried to fix categories. Hincmar could complain that when men hoped to profit they turned to the law, but when that failed they took refuge in capitula, with the result that neither was fully kept. This episode gives us a snapshot of normative pluralism that invited harmonization through text and procedure. The response was more writing, more subscription lists, and more archived proofs, so that future audiences would find fewer angles from which to reinterpret what had been done. Finally, West warns that our sources themselves participate in this work of coding. Reports of ritual can be hostile, celebratory, or simply strategic. Philippe Buck's caution that ceremony survives to us as textual effect is borne out by cases like Rothard of Soissons' deposition, where the same crowd appears as a spectacle in one account and is reframed in another. Precisely because events could be sabotaged or recoded, Carolingian actors doubled down on ordines, capitularies, recitations, signatures, and archives. The aim was not to eliminate ambiguity, impossible in practice, but to reduce its bandwidth to a manageable range. In the absence of a permanent bureaucracy, Carolingian rule materialized in the rhythm of royal assemblies. These placeta or mala were the empire's visible centers of deliberation and performance, convened under royal auspices and witnessed by bishops, counts, abbots, and the optimates. West reconstructs them as theaters of rule, choreographed rituals of presence and assent. Against this background, assemblies were instruments of clarification, less about deliberation after open debate and more about making alignment visible, who was in favor, who was sliding out, and where consensus lay so that coordinated politics remained possible. These were not decision-making bodies, for the decisions had usually already been made behind closed doors, nor were they intended to promulgate these decisions, for that could be done through writing. Rather, their rationale was more communicative, their function more self-referential. Who was in favor? Who was on the way out? These were the questions assemblies came together to decide upon, like a gigantic focus group analyzing itself, with, as an outcome of each meeting, a slightly reconfigured social field. In other words, the General Frankish Assembly was largely about working out and communicating relative social status, a way of discerning the grain of consensus to make a coordinated politics possible. From Charles West, reframing the feudal revolution, political and social transformation between Marne and Moselle assemblies thus served as spaces where politics, piety, and performance collapsed into a single spectacle. Homilies announcing divine mandate, written decrees confirmed aloud, gifts and oaths exchanged, and meals reinforcing hierarchy. Stage management through the order of speakers, set pieces, and scripted acclamations sought to suppress secondary resonances, to push one reading of events to the fore. Some meetings were even written up collectively and signed, then recited back to inscribe assent into the record. At Thionville in 835, this choreography reached a high pitch when the minutes of the meeting was written and signed by all gathered in the assembly, then recited back after. Charters and capitularies extended this performative logic onto parchment. Each document was a speech act with witnesses, an event that made authority legible and reproducible. The written word did not substitute for ritual. It was ritual fixed in script. Subscription lists and witness columns testified to consensus royal diplomas, displayed carefully chosen formulae of grace and command. Conciliar decrees carried the signatures of bishops whose presence reified unity. Inns shows that charters traveled through chains of reading, citation, and recitation. On the most local, village level, it may well have been above the vernacular, oral, ritual aspect of legal action which mattered to participants, whilst the Latin literacy of the charter became more important as one moved to the city or the monastery. But this gulf was never unbridgeable. Charters were worth having, and their contents were communicated in the vernacular and through ritual. The ability to read, still less to write, a charter did not need to be widespread for the written word to play a central part in law in practice. From Matthew Innes, State and Society in the early Middle Ages, the Middle Rhine Valley. Hence local counts proclaimed them in assemblies, abbots entered them into cartularies, and royal scribes archived them for posterity. Through this choreography of record, the empire achieved a memory of itself, and the parchment became a script for reenactment in future gatherings. Oaths were pulled into the same clarifying orbit as other instruments of Carolingian governance. Innes emphasizes the shift from selective, elite fidelitas, or bonds between king and grands, to a universalized sacramentum imposed across the freemanry. This transformation took shape in the wake of the 785 conspiracy, as Charlemagne sought to reassert loyalty not merely as a personal or aristocratic tie, but as a kingdom-wide ethical alignment. As a direct result of the conspiracy of 785, an oath of fidelity to Charlemagne was extracted from each free man in the kingdom, and the oath of fidelity was to be insisted upon by Charlemagne through the rest of his reign and by his successors. Whereas previously a handful of influential aristocrats had sworn fidelitas, now fidelitas was expected by all. Each man was placed in a direct relationship to the king, which was not to be complicated by mutual oaths sworn with neighbors and friends. From Matthew Innes, State and Society in the early Middle Ages, the Middle Rhine Valley. Each free man now swearing allegiance reconfigured horizontal bonds under a centralized, king-centered moral economy. Innes calls this the rise of universalis fidelitas, a new mode of rule enacted by collective oath-taking and ritual submission. Reynolds, however, cautions against reading this oath regime as a blueprint for a uniform or permanent vassalage system. She notes that prescriptions like the 805 order that an oath be made only to the emperor and one other lord, and the 806 divisio regnorum were circumstantial measures shaped by immediate political crises rather than systematic doctrine. The widely imposed royal oaths of 802, 854, and 873, for instance, were not equivalent to feudal bonds. Instead, Reynolds argues, their meaning was categorical. Fidelity was owed because he was king, not due to any reciprocal fealty contract. And I quote, "From 789, at any rate, all males over 12 years old were supposed to take oaths of fidelity to the king, or, later, the emperor. In 802, the oath was to be faithful to the emperor, as a man ought to be to his lord, sicut per drictum debit, esse homo domino suo. In 854, all Franks in Charles, the Bald's kingdom, were to swear to be as faithful to Charles as they knew how, as a Frankish man, by right ought to be to his king. Whatever the origin or implication of their wording, oaths of fidelity that were taken so generally cannot have created a personal bond between the subject and the king, or have been meant to do so. What bound subjects to the king was the fact that he was king. From Susan Reynolds, Fiefs and Vassals, the medieval evidence reinterpreted. Jurists and bishops also participated in this normative tightening. Hincmar of Rheims famously complained of the legal ambiguity caused by competing textual regimes, and I quote, "Quando enim sperant aliquid lucrari ad legem si convertant, quando viro per legem non istament acquira ad capitula confugiant." When they hope to gain something, they turn to the law. When they do not think the law will serve them, they flee to the capitula. Hincmar's own attempt to discipline legal ambiguity through procedural refinements like distinguishing baniti, or summoned, from maniti meaning obligated to appear, served to fix categories and practice to prevent one from gaming the summons. The bishop blamed counts for manipulating the banners to avoid sending real troops. As West also warns, even these efforts to fix meaning through ritual and text were fragile. Our sources themselves participate in the work of codification. Ritual accounts diverge wildly depending on political perspective. The 863 deposition of Bishop Rothad of Soissons is instructive. Hincmar presents the scene as a grand spectaculum, a public humiliation before 500 witnesses, while Rothad's supporters depict the same event as coercive, their chants drowned out by intimidation. West reads this divergence through Philippe Buck's framework of ritual as textual effect. The ceremony's meaning was as much the product of its written portrayal as of its performance, and I quote, requested to justify his actions. Hincmar of Rheims, who had presided over the deposition, argued that Rothad could not now reasonably be reappointed as bishop because 500 people had witnessed the deposition, had seen him calmly arriving at the synod's door and leaving it like a madman. These people had come to the synod in truth as to a spectacle. It so happens that Rothad himself also mentioned this same crowd, but put in rather a different interpretative light. For him, this crowd, composed of people from the city and the region around it, went to lobby in his favor the papal legates when they arrived. Although they were dispersed by the threats and violence of Bishop Urchenraus of Chalons, lest they disrupt events. Were these people voyeuristic and impressionable bystanders, or Rothad's mustard-keen supporters? That depends whom you read, precisely the kind of dilemma to which Buck drew attention. From Charles West, reframing the feudal revolution, political and social transformation between Marne and Moselle. The response to such fragility was more writing. Assemblies became theatrical arenas of rule, placita or mala, where authority was enacted through recitation, subscription, and archiving. Innes describes charters traveling across space and time, performed by counts at assemblies, recopied by abbots into cartularies, and archived by royal scribes. This choreography of record enabled the empire to remember itself. Documents became scripts for the reenactment of past consent, projecting current action into a legitimized past and a memorialized future. Oaths and penance bound these performances to the moral order. The Sacramentum Fidelitatis was a moralized, public form sworn on relics, before congregations, in liturgies that blurred the political and sacred. Conversely, penitential rites dramatized the restoration of broken order. Bishops wept, supplicants knelt, psalms were sung. Hummer has shown that episcopal councils turned penance into political theater, embedding submission and reconciliation into choreographed acts of governance. Finally, gifts, hospitality, and royal presence completed the cycle. Kings ruled by being seen, by arriving at estates where loyalty was expressed through food, service, and symbolic exchange. In return, kings distributed garments, coins, and signs of favor. Hospitality was both fiscal and moral, a mechanism for embedding authority in everyday interactions of provisioning and presence. Thus the empire lived an order where authority existed insofar as it was seen, sworn, and archived. The Carolingian liturgy of power choreographed mutual recognition, endlessly rehearsed in ceremonies, signatures, and sermons across the empire. Across the 10th and 11th centuries, the Carolingian synthesis loosened into a patchwork whose rules still bound, even as they failed to scale. The 9th century proved foundational for what followed. Patterns Carolingians had formalized in property, writing, and ritual shaped later authority, yet were realized unevenly, as those inheritances were taken up by new actors under new pressures. Symbolic communication and written procedure did not replace one another, as ordines, capitularies, and choreographed assemblies coexisted with gifts, processions, and oaths. We must make clear that the problem was not the absence of institutions, rather their friction with changing scale. Alsace, in this time, shows how royal imperatives were absorbed into local proprietorial frameworks. The precarial census expanded after Herstal, yet drew on earlier regional precedents, and its valuation varied with context. The result was coordination through familiar channels, but also unevenness when central exhortation met local practice. This mixture of exhortation and adaptation proved durable, but would also harden into routine that constrained adjustment later on. Matthew Innes warns against retrofitting a modern state versus society lens onto this world. Early medieval rule blurred with local regulation. The rhetoric of res publica existed, yet enforcement floated on social consensus, collective action, and negotiated norms rather than on a distant apparatus. And I quote, the long-established historiographical tendency to see the timeless objective of rulers, always and everywhere, as the creation of a centralized state administered through bureaucratic institutions, has encouraged generations of scholars to view early medieval history in terms of the opposition between public and private power. The former a good thing identified with kings, the latter a bad thing exemplified by the aristocracy. Privileging public versus private as an interpretative modality creates ahistorical contrasts between order and disorder, harmony and conflict, as the self-image of the modern state as the only guarantor of social peace is read back into the Middle Ages. Periods of crisis at the political center have thus normally been seen as necessarily and naturally marked by social disorder, an ingrained assumption which is now challenged both by the empirical evidence and by historiographical worries about the equation of state and social order. The public-private dichotomy also encourages us to separate state and society, and to see government as a series of institutions and activities defined by the political center. This is problematical in a world where the act of ruling cannot be distinguished from the more or less homeostatic processes of social regulation in the localities. From Matthew Innes, State and Society in the Early Middle Ages, the Middle Rhine Valley. At the same time, Susan Reynolds underscores that medieval political belonging was widely imagined as a shared realm. Res publica and related language occur before the 12th century scholastic boom, and kingship was ordinarily conceived as more than stacked personal ties. She also stresses that norms pulled in different directions, with hierarchy and obedience conflicting with mutuality, custom, and collective judgment, such that consensus was never seamless. When new, customary forms of coercive lordship became widely normalized through status anchored in banal powers and castles, recurrent confrontations between lordly domination and claims of public order followed suit. Increasing societal complexity led to pacification, remedy, and legislation struggling to catch up with lived practices of power. Thus we see a tightening cage of norms as Semiglu and Robinson warned against. Procedures, rituals, and property scripts that had organized the Carolingian world continue to authorize action. Even when demographic growth, market thickening, and militarized localities demanded more adaptable channels. Thus the collapse, in this sense, meant neither simple breakdown nor smooth transition. It does mark, however, the time when inherited Carolingian forms previously so effective at making authority legible began to bind as much as they enabled, and when the struggle to re-articulate them produced the mix of coercion, codification, and experimentation that contemporaries experienced as crisis. Vladimir Maltsev's core claim is straightforward. Under the right background conditions, communities can move to thick market equilibria without building a state by copying existing institutional templates and adapting them at low cost. In 16th century Japan, shinobi communities in Iga and Koka faced a predatory, fragmented political landscape, yet did not centralize. Instead, they formed voluntary confederations governed by private constitutions, or ikki. They achieved higher trade as mercenary suppliers without a monopoly of violence. The mechanism that allowed this equilibrium was the availability of an institutional skeleton, a familiar repertoire of rules and procedures already circulating in the Sengoku environment, which could be imported and modified cheaply. Maltsev situates the ninja solution in a market for governance. Sengoku Japan maintained a market in private governments, with monasteries, leagues, and warlords competing to supply order. Within that market, ikki appear as self-governing leagues organized on relatively egalitarian lines and bound by written constitutions. Crucially, participation rested on voluntary, explicit consent and freedom of exit, marking these bodies as club-like private governance rather than territorial states. The Oyamoto example, 1494, makes the template visible in action. An initial 5-article constitution signed by 350 individuals was later expanded, again by explicit consent, to admit 46 warrior families. Maltsev reads this as institutional bootstrapping. A ready-made template was copied and tweaked to suit new entrants with negligible drafting and learning costs. The Iga Constitution's content shows why copying worked. On the protective side, articles banned violent encroachment inside the Confederacy and committed members to collective defense. On the productive side, the Constitution financed relay stations and a war fund, underwriting mobility and liquidity, public goods essential to a mercenary export economy. By standardizing expectations, the text created common knowledge, and by threatening exclusion from benefits, it supplied an internal enforcement lever, features that made reproduction of the template attractive and low risk for imitators. Maltsev explicitly frames the environment as tie-bout-like competition in governance. Misrule risks membership exit, so leagues had incentives to keep rules predictable. Templates also scaled horizontally. Article 11 of the Iga Constitution called for coordination with Koka, and contemporary sources report the Ikkai Gun Ikkai My Oath, one district and one band, to share intelligence and guarantee mutual access, a written federative commitment periodically renewed in border meetings. This is template copying across jurisdictions, two leagues adopting each other's idioms to reduce transaction costs of cooperation. Two analytic payoffs follow from Maltsev's case. First, copying lowers organizational cost. When rule forms are already legible, communities can enact them without building a hierarchy. Governance becomes a documentation problem more than an engineering one. Maltsev's language of an existing skeleton captures this portability. Second, competition disciplines providers. With voluntary entry-exit, leagues face market checks on predation. The same trait that makes templates easy to copy also keeps them contestable. This rationale of copying templates is not unique to Japan's shinobi ikki. Northern China exhibited it for most of its history. In Western Europe, town constitutions and customs spread through conscious copying. Charters explicitly granted the customs of another town, and municipal regulations proliferated as communities confronted similar problems with a shared evaluative vocabulary. And I quote, "The final impression left after an attempt to compare urban constitutions in different parts of Western Christendom, and to set them against a background of contemporary law and politics outside towns, is that they are much more similar than one would gather from reading the histories of towns country by country. Vocabularies differed, and so did the degree of complexity, but the framework of councils and offices, rotating part-time service, assemblies, elections, and audits was very much the same. Some of the similarities were the result of conscious copying. The consuls of southern France and Germany, like the mayors of England, show that, as do the many charters which granted one town the customs of another. Nevertheless, simple diffusion tells only half the story. The way in which councils proliferated and regulations burgeoned shows that they were responses to problems. Where the problems were most acute, the solutions were most complex. But the nature of the complexities shows that the problems were evaluated by much the same standards everywhere. All town communities took much the same view of what their rulers were supposed to do or not do. From Susan Reynolds, Kingdoms and Communities in Western Europe, 900 to 1300. In the Carolingian world, charter formulae themselves were copied from Merovingian formularies, carrying forward a language of the public into new contexts. By the 8th, 9th centuries, invoking public action came less from formal institutions than from staged visibility and consent, precisely because trusted models existed that could be performed and recorded locally. Maltsev's case helps disentangle imitation from sclerosis. Copying can be malleable. Iga's constitution was adapted, federated, and scaled by consent, or it can harden into scripts that resist local variation. The difference lies in contestability through exit options and competing venues, and in how the template is embedded, whether in club-like membership or through territorial monopoly. Maltsev's private constitutions worked because they remained voluntary, modular, and revisable. Much of the European experience, especially once market and population density increased, gravitated toward licensed monopolies of office and jurisdiction, making template revision politically costly. Maltsev's case resonates with a broader literature that finds stable private governance in weak state settings when club goods, exit, and reputational enforcement are present. Our point here is not to equate settings, but to clarify the mechanism. Widely legible templates, constitutions, formularies, customs allow communities to copy, tweak, and federate rules faster than a central authority can scale a bureaucracy until demographic and commercial thickening stretches those templates beyond their elastic range. Throughout the 9th century, lordship gradually emerged as the most intelligible and enforceable language of power across much of the Frankish world. As royal presence ebbed, county structures were reworked, property relations thickened, and after 100 years authority was increasingly exercised through rights in things, rents, banal dues, tolls, mill and oven rights, rather than through the older choreography of assemblies alone. Even as courts, palaces, and assemblies continued to anchor political life, royal authority grew more unseen. Kings had become more remote to local actors in Champagne and Lotharingia. Charles West traces this disappearance to institutional pressures on the local level that gave rise to new practices, leaving older, court-centered structures less necessary. Much interaction still ran through familiar public venues: Malor under counts, scabini adjudication, and itinerant royal patronage. Even Otto's late 10th century power relied on conventional levers like the control of monasteries, use of royal and ecclesiastical estates to seed obligation networks, and recourse to public meetings for judgment. Patronage remained the coin of politics, the malus the forum that processed local affairs. In fact, in Alsace, royal authority remained unusually immediate under the Ottonians. Advocacy over major abbeys, royal reform, and papal linkages created a synergy that redefined how secular and spiritual jurisdictions interacted. One can easily trace this presence, however, to Alsace's proximity to kingship and reform. The land thus makes a telling contrast to areas where royal presence thinned. The centre's pulse weakened in many places, but did not stop. Courtly itineration, royal gifts, and public hearings still mattered. What changed was the frequency and reach of royal intervention and the growing ability of powerful local actors, especially ecclesiastical managers, to broker order without routine royal prompting. One dimension was legal. By the later 11th century, we see systematic attempts to write out entire lordships, defining a county's contents, delimiting an honor, and enumerating jurisdictions such as vice-comitatus, and then transferring, splitting, or granting these rights en bloc. West shows how such bundles, whether labeled banum, justicia, districtus, or consuetudo, were treated as distinct from mere land ownership, in other words, as portable jurisdictions. That shift underpins the view of a wider reification of political power. A second dimension was social. By the 11th century, household, familiae, under lordly jurisdiction had become legally recognized, relatively abstracted from the wider community. By the 12th, lordly jurisdiction was not only personal, but increasingly territorial. That trajectory from public processing in the malus to corporate units encapsulated under lords marks a fundamental change in the scale and location of routine power. Finally, material incentives and heredity blurred earlier distinctions. Bisson highlights a watershed moment in 877, when Charles the Bald's concessions on succession to tenures confused older lines between royal fiscal and proprietary rights, inaugurating a longer patrimonialization across many regions. In the 11th century, tenures and fiscal shares functioned as lordships in their own right. The drive to create power over people, not just to mobilize wealth, propelled local jurisdictions to multiply. Alsace, again, offers a view for watching the pieces shift. The Etechonids' long-standing proprietary ties to monasteries came under pressure from reform and Ottonian consolidation. Branches that lost monastic props either vanished or reinvented themselves through new foundations, more tightly aligned with reformed norms and supralocal authority. That is, new hierarchies grew where family, church, and kingship resorted their mutual claims. Taken together, the ebb of routine royal presence and the flow of new documentary, legal, and ecclesiastical practices yielded hierarchies built from portable packages of rights, lordly familiae, and territorially articulated jurisdictions. West calls the end state the banality of power, and his work shows how it was assembled piecemeal. By recording and transferring rights, by enclosing community action within lordly frameworks, and by rendering authority actionable without constant royal staging. Charles West calls the banality of power, the rise and reification of banal jurisdiction as the right to command, to compel labor, or to levy fines as a privatized framework through which lords made order legible and profitable. And I quote, "What we might call banal terminology grew increasingly wide-ranging in the course of the late 11th and early 12th centuries. Mills and ovens, in the course of transfer, or sometimes as the subject of disputes, were specified as being banales, which is usually interpreted as meaning that their use was compulsory. These facilities and the revenues they raised, known generally as banalités, are attested again on both sides of the Meuse before, and sometimes well before, 1130, though here the weight of early evidence has shifted to the west. Examples are recorded in documents from Rosnay, St. Dizier and Vauxhalls in the south, Epinay and Reims in the west, Deuilly and Buvelas in the east, and St. Prix, Longpont and Chateau Portion in the north. Even processions to particular churches were described as banal, though the phenomenon is very difficult to date, and the term was also occasionally applied to the people subject to various compulsory requirements, who were labeled as banals. Banal terminology also began to take a pronounced spatial sense. 2. Giving rise to the Banaluga, meaning a zone with particular judicial significance, from which comes modern French banlieue. From Charles West, reframing the feudal revolution, political and social transformation between Marne and Moselle. The droits bannorks, as later jurists called it, emerged from a slow, textual reworking of the older banners, the right to command, summon, and penalize, into localized, revenue-bearing, and jurisdictional packages. The earliest bannal, phrases around the Marne-Moselle area before AD 1000 cluster in charters that are either forged or heavily suspect. The first secure occurrences happen over the next century, and from the 1060s the language thickens, above all in Benedictine archives, until by the early 12th century it is routine. This new usage spread across everyday infrastructures. Mills and ovens, already ubiquitous and capital-intensive in the 9th century, begin to be specified as banales in transfers or disputes, a label usually taken to mean compulsory use and payment. Dossiers on both banks of the Meuse are rife with early 12th century and sometimes pre-1130 examples. The terminology even grew connotations regarding processions and occasionally to people themselves. The infrastructure long predated the obligation. Polyptychs show watermills dense on great 9th century estates, with 84 at Saint-Germain-des-Prés alone and dozens elsewhere. These were engineered by abbots with dams, canals, and multi-wheel setups. Tenants operated them and rendered grain in kind, but sources do not yet require every villager to grind there. That later compulsion, the banal turn, rides on top of a Carolingian millscape. What changed after 1050 to 1100 was the juridical casing of those facilities and of village life around them. In West's material, the bannum leaves the king's orbit and becomes a thing that can be claimed, granted, litigated, and counted alongside rents. Mills, ovens, tolls, and peace or justice revenues are described under banal headings and fought over as if they were property. The litigation that proliferates after 1060 does not merely name a prerogative. It operationalizes one by treating the ban as a transferable bundle. Two trends underlay that shift. First, as royal presence flickered and itineraries stretched, the old public bannus was asserted locally and then stabilized by writing. Second, intensifying agrarian and market activity raised the stakes around nodal assets like mills, ovens, presses, and bridges. Compulsion became attractive as a coordination device that also yielded cash or grain. The broader craving for status and possession of castles tied into these banal powers, making coercive lordship a pervasive custom by 1050 to 1100. A territorial thickening followed. Castellanies and lesser jurisdictions congealed into areas known by the ban, within which lords extended controls, dues, and services even over freer lot holders. At this level, rights of government and rights of property blur. The ban is exercised through control of holdings, lists of customs, and grants of dues. By the 12th century, the terminology had hardened enough to take on a spatial life as banaluga, a social life as banils, and a fiscal life as banalites. Mills and ovens were only the most visible faces. The ban also framed corvées, road and bridge duties, peacekeeping fines, and petty judicial incomes, precisely the hybrid zone where government and property converge. That convergence, contested in court and copied into archives, thus took life as a thickening mesh of written, enforceable compulsion radiating from seigneurial nodes into the countryside. Across the long 12th century, Europe's economy accelerated and its social fabric thickened. Agricultural expansion, rising population, and a denser web of exchange produced new kinds of towns, institutions, and literate expertise. The result wasn't a simple birth of markets, but a layered transformation in how communities coordinated production, circulated goods, and arbitrated conflict. On the countryside, clearance and colonization kept pace with demographic growth, while estate managers and monastic orders systematized extraction and investment. Powerful congregations like the Cistercians shifted from subsistence aims to rational farming and large-scale sheep breeding organized through granges, aided by rudimentary literacy and accounting among landholders. Population growth and ongoing expansion of cultivated acreage remained the underlying engine into the mid-13th century. Urban growth tracked those rural dynamics, and I quote, "Population and wealth in the countryside were growing, and it was above all that which stimulated urban growth, by increasing the demand for goods and services which towns could provide. The lowest level of need could be met by the proliferation of weekly markets, many of which never turned into permanent trading places with resident traders and craftsmen. But some places in Flanders and Germany, for instance, which were destined to become great and privileged centers of long-distance trade, seem to have made their first discernible steps towards dramatic urban growth when 10th or 11th century lords or bishops founded markets in them. From Susan Reynolds, Kingdoms and Communities in Western Europe, 900 to 1300. Lords and bishops founded markets that became privileged centers of long-distance trade in places like Flanders and Germany. Within exchange networks, new nodal points emerged. Flemish textiles fueled a trade boom between cloth centers, champagne fairs, and Italian merchants. The fairs themselves served as clearing houses for northern cloth and Mediterranean goods, knitting together regional specializations. Letters of exchange, a grassroots paper currency, highlights the growth of organizational tools that lowered transaction risks and distributed capital over faraway lands. Monetary and commercial instruments complemented these geographies. While Carolingian coin reform had earlier imposed a common silver, the 12th century saw thicker monetization and periodic recoinages in different realms. Here we see an economy capable of self-repair, absorbing localized shocks, wars, bank failures, mine depletion through rerouting and institutional tinkering. The same urbanization that intensified trade also seeded schools and professional expertise. The 12th century saw urban schools overtake monastic predominance, drawing crowds to masters whose teaching would coalesce into universities at Bologna and Paris. That intellectual inheritance of law, theology, and rhetoric multiplied the number of literate actors capable of drafting, interpreting, and contesting norms. The 12th century thus saw institutional expansion, intellectual creativity, and cultural efflorescence, with translation and cross-regional connectivity as typical cultural activities. Of course, the 12th century surge in population, silver supply, towns, and schools built on tendencies already visible in the Carolingian world. Nonetheless, by the 1100s, the combination yielded a different operating environment. More people, more goods, more writing, and more venues of adjudication stretched older ritual and customary scripts, inviting formalization in law and procedure. Flourishing farmer towns with notaries and judges pop alongside persistent rural poverty from Tuscany to Alpine valleys. From this, one can glean a dynamic economy capable of supporting thicker layers of non-agrarian roles: artisans, officials, middlemen, students. That social diversification, in turn, generated new conflicts over tolls, markets, debts, and jurisdiction, exactly the kinds of disputes that produced more documents, more courts, and more codification. Put together, this commercial revolution and 12th century Renaissance saw expanding agrarian surpluses and trade creating volume and volatility that pressed communities toward new organizational solutions. The boom in schools and legal technique supplied the tools to articulate and administer them. The density of actors and transactions made earlier, largely customary coordination harder to sustain without textualized, professionalized supports. By the late 11th and 12th centuries, the Carolingian way of making order, custom articulated in assemblies, oaths keyed to persona and place, estate management rendered legible through inventories and rent lists, was running into the density of a changing economy and society. Population, cultivation, and circulation all thickened. Merchants wove regional circuits into continental ones, Fairs and maritime hubs synchronized seasons of trade. Credit and partnership forms multiplied. The scale shift from new urban centers, champagne fairs, and the spread of bills and trade over faraway lands knit together a Europe that now had to coordinate far more transactions than the old village and villa were built to process. Intellectual and institutional renewal pushed in the same direction. The long 12th century produced an infrastructure of schools, jurists, and literate office holders that enlarged the repertoire of rule. Systematic teaching, standardized procedures, and legal reasoning moved from monasteries and courts into towns and princely households. This renaissance took life as a sustained expansion of intellectual activities that remade social practice. The period's novelty saw the steady thickening of tools like texts, techniques, and personnel for organizing complex life. Under the pressure of that complexity, the old customs hardened, then cracked. At ground level between Marne and Moselle, rights that Carolingian texts had treated as situational began to be named, separated, traded, and fought over as distinct objects. Banum, districtus, vice comitatus, justitia, consuetudo. By the mid-11th century, these labels and categories appear in charters as packages of jurisdiction separable from land ownership, and they become the very subject of disputes. In 12th century cases, litigants no longer dispute about who ownership alone over the village. They dispute whose is the banum, with courts explicitly distinguishing the holder of jurisdiction from the holder of the soil. As these categories stiffened, communities sought to fence the arbitrariness that came with them. Franchise charters highlight how renunciations of bad customs and arbitrary exactions rise to the top of concession lists from 1100 onward. Henry I's coronation charter, Louis VI's commune at Mantes, and frontier invitations like Barbastro speak a shared language. Free status from unreasonable exactions, predictability of dues, recognizable limits on provosts and marinos. The target was less the faraway king than the nearer agent. Charters curbed the intermediate arbiters whose discretionary take had grown with the monetization of lordship. At the same time, towns were not blank slates. Urban institutions spread through conscious imitation, with charters granting the customs of another town, and through problem-driven rule-making that looked strikingly similar across Europe. Copying worked because locales and lands converged on similar problems: immigration, fast turnover of goods and property, and strangers at law. Publicity and assembly were urban constants, and the explosion of 12th century documents recorded what communities already expected rather than inventing it wholesale. Towns adapted their older customs to new scales with freer alienation of urban land, money rents, and procedures for itinerant traders. Signs that daily practice had outrun older rural scripts and needed codified urban answers. Monasteries and bishops, long the empire's accountants, were pulled into this recalibration. The precarial census, rent for use of church land, was standardized and monetized across parts of Alemannia, assessed in denarii, fixed to St. Martin's Day, and extended beyond narrow kin-circles. He ties the late 8th century proliferation of such rents to the fiscal needs of an assertive Carolingian rulership that relied on ecclesiastical patrimony as its balance sheet. The effect was to translate diffuse customary yields into regularized, audit-friendly flows. The very success of this translation, however, fed new frictions. When rents, tolls, and offices become objects, they invite multiplication and brokerage. West shows forged and interpolated charters that retroject banal clauses into the 8th century, an index of contemporary priorities, to nail down compulsory mills, ovens, and fines as inheritable rights. By the 1100s, banal terminology attached not only to facilities, but to zones, the bannerluga that prefigures the modern banlieue, mapping space through jurisdictional compulsion. The old expectation that custom decides turned into fights over which custom, whose court, and which fee schedule. Meanwhile, publicness itself shifted from a royal attribute to a quality of places and procedures. Evidence from the Middle Rhine evidence is explicit. Scribes called certain cities public, not because the king owned them, but because they were recognized stages for visible legal action. Charters were designed to be read aloud and brandished in those venues. The archive amplified the square, and the square validated the archive. The performative liturgy of powers could coordinate a sparse world. In thicker settings, it generated backlog, more readings, more confirmations, more appeals, until communities and lords reached for more explicit scripts. Hence the 12th century turned to writing as discipline rather than mere record. Franchised texts, custumals, Weistümer, and urban statutes tried to freeze the moving parts of obligation. Susan Reynolds notes how difficult it is to tell novelty from confirmation, precisely because these documents often wrote down what everyone said had always been true. The real point was to remove angles for opportunistic reinterpretation. Villagers now collectively declared their law or had their dues scheduled like a polyptych, with communities now pushing managers to accept stable calendars of demand through managed, predictable coercion instead of a discretionary levy. All this unfolded alongside the proliferation of new sworn bodies. Bisson observes that communal engagements first resembled oaths of fidelity. People swore to the community and to the peace, and bishops complained that such fidelities were against them. The form was old, even conservative, yet the object had changed. Oath chains that once stabilized vertical relationships now bound horizontal corporations with programmatic ends, and they provoked counter-codifications from lords and princes. East of the Rhine, a complementary story centers on taxation and policing. Episcopal cities levied transport and consumption dues. Princely founders created new markets, Markt, that soon turned into cities with jurisdictional threads and sworn obligations to pay and defend. The sworn oath of citizenship that folds tax duty into membership neatly summarizes the period's direction. Fiscal legal identity merged with civic identity. The real collapse thus lay in norms that once made rule intelligible. Unwritten custom, moralized lordship, ad hoc oaths, itinerant presence. They could not keep pace with the volume and variety of claims as society grew more complex. The response was more categories, more writing, more places consecrated as public, more offices with bounded powers, more corporate oaths, and more predictability. Evidence throughout all Western Europe all point to the same structural change. A society that outgrew the cage of inherited norms and began to recode itself so that obligation, jurisdiction, and exchange could be processed at scale. Thus it was rebuilt, bar by bar, into a frame that later kings, communes, and courts could recognize as law, office, and jurisdiction. That is why so much of the change looks like paperwork and placemaking. The 12th century Renaissance and commercial revolution flooded custom with procedure. And in that deluge, Europe learned to govern complexity with new templates that were already, in embryo, inside the Carolingian file. Much of the 12th century was, paradoxically, also a time of flowering. In markets, in letters, in law, in towns. The very pressures that strained old norms, demographic growth, commercial densification, mobility, competition, simultaneously opened spaces for innovation. Far from desolation, many regions saw expansion, conflict, and renewal appear side by side. To grasp the regional patterns of collapse, we should see them as places where the cage of norms broke in different directions, not all at once or uniformly, and where economic, intellectual, and cultural density amplified fracture even as it offered the tools to reforge order. We begin with acknowledging a recurring paradox. Societal rupture and cultural renaissance often travel together. Ada Palmer writes thus on her blog Exurb, and I quote, "When times get desperate, those in power pour money into art, architecture, grandeur, even science, because such things can provide legitimacy and thus aid stability. Intimidating palaces, grand oratory, epics about the great deeds of a conqueror, expensive tutors, so the prince and princess have rare skills like Greek and music, even a chemical treatise whose dedication praises the Duke of such and such. These were all investments in legitimacy. not fruits of peace, but symptoms of a desperate time, in an era when a book cost as much as a house. And Florence's Lawrenziana library cost more per GDP than the moon landing. You don't get that level of investment unless elites think they're going to get something out of it. Just as today giant corporations fund charities or space tech because they get something out of it, publicity raising their stock prices. So a mighty merchant family might repair a church or build a grand public square and put their coat of arms on it, drawing investment and intimidating rivals. From Black Death, COVID, and why we keep telling the myth of a Renaissance golden age and bad Middle Ages, the pattern recurs in 12th century Europe. In the fragmented border zones of Lotharingia, Champagne, and the Moselle, local magnates, bishops, and towns retooled the liturgical and legal vocabularies they inherited. Where royal reach slackened, new lordships claimed banality. Where jurisprudential sophistication expanded, more disputation and recodification followed. The regional map is marked by variance. In some areas, royal norms held longer. In others, private jurisdiction exploded early. In yet more, urban fortunes turned the local public order into civic corridors of negotiation. Societal collapse happens through fragmentation, with overlapping claims, competing legal orders, the rise of arbitrage, and zones of exception. Yet those same zones are where credit and contract take root, where literate elites draft new formularies, where towns incorporate or resist their lords, and where ecclesiastical houses flex administrative muscle. The free-for-all in 12th century Europe emerged from diversified order in multiple strata, whether local lordships, episcopal logistics, urban charters, or noble leagues, each striving for legitimacy, coherence, and extraction. Thus, we shall trace how public order unraveled regionally, how the old scripts of Carolingian legitimacy lost traction, how contests over banality, jurisdiction, and dues became contentious battlefields, and how economic and cultural flourishing in towns, in notarial schools, or in market circuits offered both stress and resource to the actors, forging new hierarchies. We shall how different zones all navigated the collapse differently, and how the new institutions founded after the crisis adapted legacies to emerging density. The Marne-Moselle corridor and the Champagne Plain saw authority redistributed into forms that bit closer to the ground. That is, institutions for governance became harder-edged, more profitable, and more contestable. Public order thinned at the center and thickened locally. In the gaps, actors armed themselves with jurisdictional language, facilities, and men. The region's abundance in grain, vineyards, towns, schools, and fairs raised the stakes and the frequency of conflict. By the early 12th century, the ban, once a royal word for command and penalty, had become everyday grammar in disputes. Terminology regarding the ban spread and diversified in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, attaching to mills and ovens in transfers and lawsuits, spawning fiscal banalités, even taking on a spatial teeth as banaluga or a zone of judicial significance. While early attested examples exist before 1130, the latter novelty was not only words. 12th century rights labeled with banal language became the very substance of litigation in a way Carolingian evidence doesn't parallel. The first documented case in Rheims for 1130 shows Saint Tremy and the archbishopric fighting not over land, for no one doubted St. Tremy owned the soil of Vrilly. Each party fought, however, over whose was the village's banum, cuius debret esse banus alere in the original Latin. The archbishop convened an inquest, taking testimony from elderly ministerials, pairing oral recall with recent papal parchment. The placitum turned on jurisdiction as an ownable thing. That pattern repeats across the plain of Champagne. Sets of rights named banum, justitia, consuetudo, districtus, or vice-comitatus appear as separable from land ownership and are disputed as such. One must note a regional nuance. Lotharingian charters prefer the label banum, while Champenois one's justitia and consuetudo. The underlying shift, however, is common. Political power became reified as packages of jurisdiction that can be granted, split, and sold. As one would expect, where rights become valuable, authenticity itself becomes a battlefield. Suspect items before the year 1000 hold the label Bannum in documents, but Patrick Healy notes 11th century tampering by Hugh of Flavigny. And I quote, "Could Hugh of Flavigny have participated in the atelier that forged these spurious bulls at St. Van? If Hugh did indeed remain at the monastery after 1114, his participation must be deemed more probable than merely possible. Few of the monks at St. Van could have rivaled his paleographical expertise. After all, Hugh was intimately aware of the cartulary into which the 3 forged papal bulls were inserted. He not only depended on this document in the composition of his chronicon, but borrowed from the cartulary of St. Van in the construction of a falsified version of the abbey's foundation charter of 951. Moreover, Hugh had plenty of experience in drafting documents, both in his diplomatic service under Abbot Jarento of St. Benin, and in the cartulary he compiled as Abbot of Flavigny. Finally, the 3 forged bulls all contain the elements with which Hugh expanded the St. Van Foundation Charter of 951. In addition, one of the forgeries contains the same kind of dating error as that included in Hugh of Flavigny's version of the Lateran Synod of 1059, no less than his role in encouraging Laurent of Liege to take up the pen in defense of the status of St. Van in the 1140s. Hugh's possible involvement in the 3 forgeries is consistent with the overall tenor of his life and career. From Patrick Healy, the Chronicle of Hugh of Flavigny, Reform and the Investiture Contest in the late 11th century. Forgers and interpolators were inserting the ban where contemporaries thought it should be, a back projection that reveals present priorities. The point is not that nothing older existed, but that the 12th century crisis made the ban worth fighting for on paper. On the ground, violence tracked this juridical hardening. By the time from 1050 to 1100, coercive lordship had become customary. The craving for status tied to banal powers and castles became visible in complaints from almost every corner of Europe. That habituation of coercion sat athwart the ideal of public order and generated recurrent conflicts. In Champagne, specifically, the documents preserve itemized grievances against oppressive advocates, a reminder that agents who enforced lordly and princely claims were the proximate face of breakdown. John of Salisbury could damn such men generically as publicani, tax farmers worse than thieves. Yet this was also the century when Champagne's fairs became Europe's most sophisticated overland clearing houses. They knit cloth, spices, bullion, and credit across linguistic and legal borders. Letters and bills of exchange, already widespread by the late 12th century, allowed large merchant companies to disguise interest through currency conversion and timing. The Champagne fairs served as natural nodes for back-and-forth flows that made the instrument hum. In other words, the same fragmentation that multiplied tolls, offices, and petty jurisdictions also multiplied venues where contracts, credit, and protection could be negotiated. The result was a dense market corridor perched on fragile, contested public guarantees. Champenois comital government tried to discipline that density. By the 1170s, the Count of Champagne at least had a list of services his greater subjects owed. These records document a paper architecture to make demands predictable in a turbulent environment. Crucially, disputes often ran between authorities rather than from subjects upward. While we rarely see peasants defeating banal claims outright, we frequently see monasteries, bishops, and counts clashing over who owns the bannum, such that jurisdictional rivalry acted as the main theater of breakdown. That rivalry generated procedures like inquests, sworn testimony, mixed proofs both oral and written, and the habit of stating whose court and which custom governs a place. It also generated zones, the Bannerluga around towns and churches where certain acts carried special weight, thus mapping publicness into space. The crisis around the Marne-Moselle corridor and the Champagne plain thus reads in the sources as a cascade of tightly local scenes. A village's grinding becomes a lawsuit about compulsion. A procession becomes banal, fenced by a lord's right to assemble bodies. A vice comitatus ministry at Trigny is argued over like a property with revenues, not a mere title, the reification of power in miniature. More than anarchy, the lands here saw overlapping, monetized allegiances and duties, pressed into text because too many actors now had something to gain, or lose, by fixing meanings. A consistent pattern emerges in the lands in Upper Lotharingia and Champagne. Royal distance leads to local jurisdictional entrepreneurship. As the king's itinerary touched the region with less routine force, episcopal houses and comital offices styled and claimed the ban in their own names. The regional split in vocabulary between banum and justitia or consuetudo marks this localization of idiom. Agents act as accelerants for the crisis. Complaints concentrate on advocates, provosts, and other surrogates who extract in the name of lords and princes. Champagne's case sits well with wider 12th century laments that bad customs proliferated where agents had room to maneuver. Economic thickening serves as both stress and solution. The fairs, credit instruments, and urban skills that intensified dispute supplied societal stabilization through safe conducts, routine contract forms, and predictable service lists. Put plainer, the pattern that comes across is customarily coercive lordship rubbing against a tenacious ideal of public order, producing recurrent crises that were patchily remedied rather than resolved. In this region, those remedies were documentary, procedural, and spatial, which reads less as the arrival of a bureaucratic mind than the scaling up of Carolingian solutions to keep pace with more people, more goods, more claims. Rights are enumerated. Banal facilities are named and enclosed. Sworn bodies and placeta regulate who may take tolls, keep the peace, or grind grain. Finally, compulsion, coercion, and jurisdiction were pinned to infrastructure and thus became legible, taxable, and litigable. By the 1170s, the crisis resolved into a more legible, litigable countryside, where the count can list services, the abbey can sue for banum, and a merchant can clear a debt at province, all because the same density that drove disorder also paid for procedure. The lands around Alsace and Middle Rhine corridor entered the 12th century with exceptionally dense infrastructures of wealth and memory. They saw monasteries with deep archives, episcopal seats on Roman sites, and a river system that concentrated traffic, dues, and confrontation. Earlier Carolingian and Ottonian patterns had already made the region unusually literate and legible. Great abbeys like Lorsch, Fulda, and Wissembourg compiled charters and polyptychs. Bishops sat where Roman cities had stood. Royal itineraries depended on Alsace's string of villi and houses. That long preparation did not prevent crisis. Instead, this infrastructure ensured that when order frayed, the conflicts would be precisely recorded and acutely fought. Across the Holy Roman Empire in the mid-11th to 12th centuries, monasteries began to complain about their ecclesiastical advocates, or Vogt. What had once been a protective office re-emerged after a century of obscurity as a lordly lever, and the dossiers from Lotharingia and Champagne show how rapidly this advocacy hardened into transferable, litigable jurisdiction. Charles West tracks the crescendo of hostile monastic testimony and stresses the chronological rupture. Advocates are largely witness. Only in the 10th century, then power brokers by the mid-11th. The new fights are not chiefly over land, but once again over banum, justitia, consuetudo, districtus, vice comitatus, all serving as packages of jurisdictional rights detachable from soil and valuable in court. That model traveled east with particular force. In the empire, advocacy intertwined with principality, as ducal and comital houses articulated control through monasteries they on paper protected. Alsace fits this imperial pattern in a way that Western kingdoms often did not. Cue long-running synergy between royal authority and reform made Alsace's monasteries unusually politically active, drawing papal protection and episcopal oversight into local balances of power. When Salians and Ottonians intervened at Wissembourg, they did so as advocates, not as proprietors, binding monastic liberties to Roman and royal guarantees, even as they channeled those liberties through lay protectors. The configuration of monastic freedom under advocacy generated exactly the kind of jurisdictional tug-of-war that becomes visible again in the 12th century when advocates turned extractive. A regional gradient thus forms where ecclesiastical advocacy is thin in the far west and robust in the empire, with varying shades in between. That is precisely the terrain of the Middle Rhine and Alsace. Episcopal and monastic wealth was thick, and advocacy became a standard way to package enforceable claims. In this setting, the crisis appears as rival institutionalization, with abbots and bishops naming bans and customs, lay protectors insisting those same words authorized dues and compulsion, and both sides fighting on parchment. The Rhine remained the corridor that stitched the region's markets and governments together. Already in the Carolingian era, we glimpse counts exercising toll power at places like Dienheim, with public courts, Mali drawing local collectivities to adjudicate dues and rights. In the 12th and early 13th centuries, that same corridor sees sworn towns coalesce under episcopal and princely umbrellas: Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Cologne, Strasbourg, Basel, where bishops and archbishops levied taxes on trade, transport, and consumption, or ungeld, and communities negotiated collective responsibility for bead or duerf. Municipal oaths and charters made tax and defense into civic obligations as urban elites of ministerial soldiers and merchants bargained space from their lords, peace and special rights areas. The fiscal language employed here emphasizes how public order migrated into urban corporate forms even as rural jurisdictions were being privatized. Urban communes did not band together overnight. The rules of Storfen later intervened through advocate offices and royal bailiffs, or Schulthesen, reclaiming slices of episcopal authority in upper Rhineland towns, and tying privileges like toll or ungeld relief to imperial protection and payment. These moves underline how fiscal instruments became the channel of political claims. Even where communities gained councils and walls, the settlement took the shape of negotiated taxes, tolls, and offices rather than a clean transfer of sovereignty, a pattern especially visible around Strasbourg and Colmar. One face of breakdown, visible in monastic complaints, was customary coercion, where local lords translated loosely defined bans into routine exactions. In the German lands, this coincided with the rise of ministerial soldiers, a service nobility that staffed both princely and episcopal rule. New demands for building and defense proliferated across the empire. If one asks how this crisis manifested day to day, the sources answer in lawsuits, inquests, oaths, and more paper. We see inquiries with sworn elders, charters collated with papal confirmations, jurisdiction denominated and priced. In the Middle Rhine, the earlier pattern of local collectivities, villages acting in common courts, groups bound by shared forest rights, later saw the Zenten emerge. By the High Middle Ages, those were the territorial units in which petty disputes were handled. Carolingian and Ottonian customs and institutions thus became named alienable rights. Let abbots and bishops present written proofs. Let counts and advocates claim banum and consuetudo as assets. Let towns swear to taxes and peace. Now we must note that the region around Alsace and the Middle Rhine never depended on land tenure to raise military forces. As we have discussed above, Carolingian and Ottonian precedents show that levies mustered through estates and households, not through neat pyramids of fiefs. The Wissembourg polyptych shows estates pooling horses, oxen, carts, and men for a tidy annual contingent. Royal domains around Nierstein and Willewillia demanded service from some free tenants and not others. Even in 980-81, the Indiculus Lauricatorum assigns round numbers of mailed horsemen to bishops, abbots, and counts. These levies are far too large to be explained by benefices alone. Those same mechanisms persisted into the 12th century. Who could organize, supply, and move men mattered more than who held what by knight's fee. When that organizational burden met denser trade, more tolls, and sharper jurisdictional packaging, frictions multiplied. Thus, on the Middle Rhine, the crisis looks less like anarchy than it does crowded enforcement, with advocates, provosts, toll keepers, and ministerial soldiers pressing claims in overlapping fields, monasteries and cities in turn documenting, contesting, and recalibrating those claims. Advocates reasserted themselves as proprietors of jurisdiction, not just protectors. Bishops monetized peace through urban taxes and tolls. Towns swore oaths into being as fiscal, military communities. Finally, monasteries upheld their liberties through legal cases and court disputes. The river amplified both the opportunities and the collisions. The same networks that fed fairs, walls, and cathedrals fueled lawsuits, toll fights, and charters upon charters. If the old Carolingian script of negotiated order cracked, it did so by multiplication rather than disappearance. More officers, more dues, and more courts piled onto each other until the region's actors forced a new settlement in the 13th century. Freer towns on paper, stronger princes and bishops in office, and a politics of finance that had learned to speak the Rhine's language. In northern Italy, the crisis emerged from too much politics crammed into too small a space. Cathedral cities, episcopal lordships, imperial claims, magnate clans, merchant syndicates, and corporate guilds all attempted to make order visible and billable. Inside walled communes whose economies were expanding faster than inherited scripts could manage. What followed was a cycle of violent competition and remarkable institution building. Sworn communes, often born as conjurations, consular regimes, territorial wars for the contado, imperial legal offensives, like Roncaglia in 1158, and when consuls could no longer referee faction, the importation of short-term podesta governments as an extraneous, so-called impartial fix. In the process, urban fiscality thickened through fodrum or colletta, hearth taxes, tolls, and market dues. Credit instruments multiplied, and legal literacy as seen from notaries, glossators, and civic statutes turned conflict into a documentary arms race. Across the Po Valley, political initiative moved from bishops and imperial officers into corporate bodies of citizens who swore collective oaths of communes and conjurations. Contemporary and near-contemporary observers conflated the forms, sometimes praising civic solidarity, sometimes denouncing conspiracies. But the core move was the same. These oaths created a public capable of taxing, judging, and fighting in the city's name. The first municipalities were often effectively lordless, improvising leadership out of the same urban elites who everywhere dominated assemblies. In Italy, the need for unity amid internal conflict pushed communes toward a single presiding officer only in the later 12th century. By the 1170s and 1180s, consular colleges in cities like Milan, Piacenza, Cremona, and Bologna had turned oath communities into governments that legislated, judged, raised money, and fielded militias. Yet the oath politics that birthed communes also alarmed their rivals. Episcopal lords and emperors could, and did, frame communal oaths as seditious conjurations subject to suppression. The legal ambivalence tracks a wider pattern where the word commune carried different weights in Germany, France, and Italy, and imperial crackdowns on conjurations targeted political danger more than juridical form. The communes fought against their bishops, against neighboring towns, and against the emperor. The economic logic was plain. War diverted resources but paid dividends for victors who secured trade routes, labor access, and lower external tolls. Interior towns slowly ground down feudal neighbors, while maritime communes leveraged navies to bargain as independent states. The Lombard League's victory at Legnano in 1176 capped this arc, with Frederick Barbarossa's defeat forcing a settlement that left communes effectively independent save for thin gestures of imperial suzerainty. While faction and intercity wars persisted, a decisive redistribution of practical sovereignty to the communes followed the victory nonetheless. Barbarossa's countermove was legal. At Roncaglia in 1158, imperial jurists trained in Bologna articulated iura regalia. regalian rights the emperor claimed in Italy, including taxes on trade and market rights. This move served both as an act of patronage toward Bolognese legists and a deliberate strategy to turn Roman law into imperial instrument. And I quote, "The emperor's legal advisors were themselves from Bologna and sought to establish Roman law as the appropriate mechanism for imposing imperial rule over the independent-minded civic communes of 12th century northern Italy." As Sean Gilsdorf points out, Frederick's decree was thus simultaneously a reward to his advisors, a mark of political patronage, and a calculated act of imperial munificence meant both to echo the deeds of the Emperor Justinian and to be incorporated within the corpus of Roman law itself. From Alex Novikov, the 12th century Renaissance, a reader, contemporary witnesses like the Genoese chronicler Caffaro placed market rights at the center of the imperial claim. The courtroom became a battlefield where communes and crown contested the ownership of public revenues. As magnate feuds deepened and consular collegiality proved brittle, many communes imported an outsider podesta to serve as a short-term, insulated chief judge and executive. His function was to arbitrate, discipline factions, and keep the peace. The podesta emerged after the mid-12th century, initially as imperial emissaries and soon as hired outsiders whose very estrangement was supposed to guarantee impartiality. The solution worked until it didn't, for the office often fused with ruling oligarchies, and unresolved conflicts drove communes to engineer ever more elaborate institutional balances in the 13th century, like popolo councils or multiple chambers. The podesta emerging, however, shows how cities admitted that law and office, not lineage, must tame violence, and it tethered civic life more tightly to notaries, court procedure, and written statutes. That legalization fed on the Bolognese school. Glossators framed property, office, jurisdiction, and res publica with a conceptual precision aristocratic habit lacked. By defining obligations objectively and justice as public, glossators and notaries gave voice to a reawakened presumption that public order was right order, while notarial formularies standardized the record of ordinary life across southern France and Italy, exactly the milieu where communes fought and bargained. The same legal expertise staffed communal governments and armed them for their fights with bishops and emperors. Communal finance thickened first where imperial and episcopal rights once lay. The fodrum, an exaction with roots in provisioning, was levied by emperors, bishops, and most importantly by communes themselves on subject villages in the Contado. Early rates show the city of Arezzo's imperial fodrum at 26 denarii per hearth in smaller towns, and 12 in cities. Meanwhile, Bologna and Milan combined hearth taxes with grain and cartage requisitions. Over the 13th century, hearth taxes or focatico were sometimes graduated to spare the poorest, while direct labor-based dues called iuvaticum, zapatici, or braxiatici persisted in the countryside. The commune thus translated jurisdiction into repeatable tax events, turning villages into fiscal catchments. At the same time, municipal taxation learned from imperial taxation and competed with it. In many towns, accounting appears only when princes or emperors demand subsidies. Cities used these moments to impose its own levies. The blurred line between public and private power meant lords, princes, and churchmen also collected taxes. In Italy, however, communal jurists, influenced by the same canonistic and Roman law debates that armed the emperor at Roncaglia, systematized civic estimi, or assessments, and market dues into an urban fiscal constitution. Money and credit followed suit. The Italian takeoff relied heavily on monetary factors, with coin output rising, small dinas proliferating often debased, and merchants paying large sums using foreign coin, bullion, or high-value commodities. These conditions pushed Italian cities toward accounting innovations, and soon, paper instruments. The implications for crisis dynamics are clear. Cities with the strongest fiscal credit endured factional shocks better and projected force into their hinterlands more effectively. No economic growth proved enough to pacify civic life. Incessant conflict between cities, between social classes, and between clan families fits the northern Italian record. The very wealth that financed walls, courts, and fleets also fed vendetta and party politics, especially the later Guelph and Ghibelline wars. The podesta never fully rose above the rulers and ruled, with constitutions admitting new councils for the popular reading like confessions that harmony had failed and politics had to be engineered. Even these confessions mark a civic victory, however, for in them Italian cities recognized conflict as permanent and built procedural containers in oaths, councils, term limits, and balanced offices to keep doing commerce, law, and war amid the storm. The breakdown of public order in northern Italy thus reads like a redistribution of popular sovereignty. Communes captured taxing and judging from bishops and counts, while emperors replied with Roman law claims to regalia. Cities answered back with notaries, statutes, and hired judges. Magnates answered in turn with steel, and the popolo with new councils. All parties learned to finance their answers. The same intensities that made Italy the most warlike urban zone in Europe also made it its most inventive in law, finance, and corporate government. By the 12th century's end, the emperor's effective base in Italy had dwindled, while custom and imperial authority had shifted behind the urban governments themselves. Independence spread through the land, checked only where stronger powers like Norman Sicily prevailed. Italy, as a cluster of urban republics, became a recognized, if disturbing, fact for outside observers. The crisis here thus emerged because order became congested with too many rights, too many dues, and too many offices. From that congestion, the durable institutions of the commune emerged: sworn associations, rule by record, and a fiscus civicus capable of waging war and paving streets in the same fiscal breath. The upheavals of King Stephen's reign looked different from shire to shire. If some contemporaries saw only slaughter, fire, and rapine, still others brought pleas before royal officers, paid farms, and watched chancery hands turn out familiar writs. The key for reconciling these narratives is to hold two facts together. The king's government neither simply collapsed nor simply held, for it thinned, shifted venue, and devolved capacities to magnates, bishops, and civic actors at different speeds in different places. That spectrum is clearest when we track what survived of Henry's government under Stephen, how earls and other local powers filled gaps during protracted civil war, what the violence looked like on the ground, how fiscal capacity varied by region, and why the end of the anarchy at Wallingford-Winchester in 1153 in fact happened as a negotiated end rather than a clean victory. Stephen began by posing as Henry I's continuator, and for a time made that plausible in practice. His coronation charter of December 1135 deliberately echoes Henry's good laws. The Constitutio Domus Regis circulated as a practical handbook for the new court, with Roger of Salisbury's administrative handiwork initially remaining in place. Indeed, the outward style of writs and charters shows substantial carryover into 1139 and 1140. Even Danegeld surfaces were not abolished in practice, despite early promises. Routine-looking acts on borough farms and royal arms continue to appear later in Henry II's rolls, indicating that outside the Angevin southwest, revenue handling could proceed, as usual, well into crisis years. The decisive attrition belongs to wartime contingencies, whether the 1139 breach with the episcopal justiciarate, the 1141 Lincoln debacle and royal capture, or the accumulated effects of defections. Chancery output dips most sharply after 1141, when mobility and crown authority were most constrained. Several royal scribes can be tracked working both before and after 1139 under Stephen's second seal, which underlines the point. The paperwork culture did not vanish, was simply throttled by civil war. In London and Middlesex, civic institutions continued to negotiate farms and liberties with the crown. Even during moments of political brinkmanship, like the communal episode, of 1141, London's officers remained competent in collecting and remitting dues. The capital is a good measure of continuity under pressure. London remained a city that could leverage its fiscal routines to bargain, yet still supply the crown when it chose to deal. In Kent, Canterbury's administrative depth and the strategic value of Dover and Rochester meant that, despite sieges and foreign landings, port and market routines remained legible. Archiepiscopal officers managed provisioning and adjudication through the turbulence, and royal acts recur when the itinerary allowed. In Essex and Hertfordshire, the St. Albans corridor shows how monastic record-keeping anchored local legality. Raiding and seat-of-war disruptions occurred, yet borough farms at Colchester and Hertford continued to be rendered in windows of calm, and abbots mediated disputes that would otherwise have gone to shire. The earldoms of Stephen's reign began as inexpensive ligatures of loyalty and soon became tools for territorial management. Up to 1139, new earldoms shored up blocks. The Beaumonts, victors of the Standard, waverers like Daubigny, all without a consistent grant of administrative substance. As civil war hardened after 1140, both Stephen and the Empress began attaching real military and administrative bite to comital creations. Later still, as some earls proved unreliable and many acted without reference to the centre, creations slowed and each side tried to work around overmighty holders. By the late 1140s, one sees unmistakable devolution in comital control of shrievalties in multiple shires. Earls issuing quitclaims of Danegeld, levying scutage, hearing crown pleas, minting coin in their own names, and taking boroughs into hand. This decentralization was beyond what Stephen longed for, but it did not always equate to nihilism. In zones where the court could not operate, comital activity functioned as a stopgap public service by keeping bridges up, paying garrisons, enforcing truces, and hearing cases, though all on comital terms. The settlement after the war makes the verdict clear. Henry II pared back comital independence, restored direct answerability of sheriffs, allowed some titles to lapse, and reconfined earls to the third penny and anurial justice, reversing the ad hoc improvisations of the 1140s. The bigod ascendancy in East Anglia shows comital substitution in full, with custody of castles, sheriffs drawn into earls' affinity, borough oversight with toll custody, and occasional coinage aligned to local needs. Norwich and Lynn continued to trade, but much of the public interface ran through comital officers until clipped back in the later 1150s. Cheshire and the Northwest saw the Earl of Chester act as a quasi-governor, raising forces, minting, administering justice, and campaigning into North Wales. Boroughs like Chester and Lancaster carried on market and port duties under comital protection. Reintegration under Henry II hinged on negotiated trimming of these extraordinary powers. Lincolnshire instead saw rival comital groupings vying for the city and its shrievalty. The Battle of 1141 and subsequent manoeuvres translated directly into who heard pleas, who commanded the mint, and who controlled rural exactions. The city's commercial position cushioned recovery, but rural tracts subject to repeated garrisoning were slower to rebound. Stripping out declensionist rhetoric does not minimize harm. Prolonged civil war tends to produce a grim but familiar repertoire: sieges, wasting, enforced labor on fortifications, requisitions in kind, arbitrary exactions presented as protection, assaults on sanctuary, torture and kidnap for ransom. The narrative sources are formulaic at times, but to dismiss the catalogue as literary flourish is to miss how often these acts can be tied to particular fronts, fortresses, and pay regimes. The better balance acknowledges that functioning courts, routine shire meetings, and continued borough remittances could coexist with significant pockets and episodes of atrocity. In Stephen's case, they did. In Gloucestershire and the Severn Valley around Bristol, near-continuous operations made castles extractive hubs. Thus protection money and hostage-taking are best documented here. Bristol's civic machine nonetheless thrived, underwriting both resistance and order, yet the countryside wore the worst of the burden. Somerset, Devon, and Cornwall all saw coastal raiding, forced carriage, and repeated garrisoning left hinterlands thin of coin and stock. Towns with access to maritime routes like Exeter, Barnstaple, and other coastal boroughs kept on trade and regained footing more quickly than interior villes. Herefordshire and Shropshire were frontier marches accustomed to violence. The Civil War intensified their normal patterns, with levies for watch and ward, enforced bridge and road work, mallets for truce breaking. Marcher administrations substituted for royal presence, levying aids and renders in the name of defence, because no pipe rolls survived for Stephen. The only systematic way to see how bad and how uneven his financial matters were is to triangulate Henry I's 1130 returns against Henry II's early rolls. Pipe rolls never capture the whole revenue, their categories are inconsistent, and arithmetic noise abounds, so any conclusions rely on mere approximations. This exercise, however, still allows comparative judgments. Some circuits resume to levels like under Henry I quickly, others still lag. Where figures rebound fast, we may infer shallow wartime capture or a quick administrative reknitting. Where they do not, we may infer deeper damage, prolonged cometal interception, or both. The results show uneven elasticity per shire. Shires that saw fast rebound include London, Middlesex, Kent, and Hampshire. In each, institutional depth and strategic indispensability favoured early normalisation. London's habit of self-taxation for walls and bridges translated smoothly into royal revenue. Kent's ports and Canterbury's chancery skills mattered for administrative reknitting. Winchester's administrative memory helped in rapid recentering. Shires with a moderate rebound in finances include Essert, Herts, Sussex, Surrey, the East Midlands Belt, and the urban poles in Yorkshire. These lands saw towns and great churches keep account and credit flowing, even as castellans and earls skimmed and skirmished. Recovery followed the strength of urban networks. Slower rebounding lands include the rural parts of Gloucestershire, parts of Somerset, Devon, Cornwall, and the Welsh Marches. Repeated ravaging and garrisoning kept yields low into the 1150s, where cometal substitution had become embedded like in East Anglian pockets or the northwest. Henry's reabsorption took longer and required his personal oversight. Looking back from December 1154, Henry's accession can look inevitable. But in early 1153, it was anything but. His continental base had only recently stabilized, and the danger of French pressure recurring always loomed. Norman loyalties were fissile, and a midwinter crossing over the English Channel crossing was a necessity gamble. The Wallingford standoff and the Peace of Winchester in December 1153 are best read as a baronage, enforcing a ceasefire between two exhausted and mutually dangerous principles. Stephen still held residual strengths and a legitimist case through Eustace, while Henry held better long-run prospects, yet still lay vulnerable. The Westminster settlement, recognizing Henry as heir, reflects the larger crisis over the continent in its negotiation under constraints. The policy moves from 1154 to 1158 saw the demolition of adulterine castles, pruning of cometal reach, resumption of sheriffly accountability, and reliance on writ, itinerary, scutage, and tallage. These moves did not constitute a return to an intact pre-1135 order, instead recoding governance for a landscape that had since become polycentric. The Civil War, thus, is best understood as a spectrum of negotiated orders under stress. Government did not vanish, simply migrating to where coercion, money, and institutional memory could still be mobilized. Earls' halls, abbeys, borough guildhalls, palatine chanceries. The Peace of Winchester saw it migrate back under a new regime that had both the means and the will to recenter it. Henry's reign did not so much rediscover an old machine as build a sturdier one from pieces that had been kept running locally. Shire courts that never entirely stopped, borough farms that continued to be rendered, ecclesiastical archives that preserved claims, and even comital administrations that, however self-serving, had maintained roads, bridges, and garrisons. England's crisis thus aligns with wider European patterns in how the density of actors and claims outgrew inherited institutions, how coercion grew localized and normalized, and how responses undertook procedural and fiscal forms, more law in the form of writ and assize, more office in the form of accountable sheriffs, and more cash in the form of scutage and tallage. Catalonia presents the crisis of the 12th century in an early, concentrated form. Here, the fraying of Carolingian-style public choreography of counts, placita, oath chains keyed to bishops and counties, preceded similar events in most of France and England by several decades. Once again, a simultaneous multiplication of coercion and a likewise burst of institutional invention followed the Carolingian institutions' fraying. Castle lordship hardened into everyday practice. Oaths shifted from personal fidelities to sworn peace leagues, written agreements or convenientiae, and urban privileges proliferated, and comital government learned to turn ports, tolls, coin, and written law into a workable public. The same landscape that housed peasant immiseration and arbitrary exactions also housed the reset of Barcelona, the repopulation of Tarragona, and legal codification in the usages. To follow the crisis here is to watch a society rewire itself under pressure, first by privatizing compulsion, then by republicizing it through text, port, and oath. Between roughly 1020 and 1060, the old county framework of the Spanish marches lost its ability to stage order on demand. Counts still issued writs and held courts, but the usual means of compulsion in men, horses, food, and stone were gathered and spent in and around castles run by lesser lineages. Castellans stitched together local hegemonies through customary levies in grain, transport, and watchward service, impositions around fortification through labor on walls or convoy duties, and routines of violent redress by seizure, hostage, and punitive fines. Written traces from this period record property and protection drifting into each other. What is sold or sworn is not just land, but custody, escort, and banal uses of mills, bridges, and ovens. In practice, jurisdiction is treated as a thing that can be transferred and inherited. In feeling, protection folded into taxes. Where royal or comital road systems had once centered movement on palaces and episcopal towns, the strongest gradients now ran between stone sites that stocked grain, arms, and men. These were extractive nodes, yet were also the only organizations with logistical capacity to police roads and host markets between them. The first sustained response lay in oath-bound councils of peace and truce, meetings under episcopal auspices with comital presence. These tried to re-embed compulsion in a moral and calendrical frame. Pieces declared zones, persons, and goods immune from harm like church property, peasants, or merchants. Spiritual and social sanctions loomed over those who violated them. Truces shut down private warfare on most days of the week and for whole seasons, compressing permissible violence into narrow windows. Sagras, or churchyard sanctuary, surfaced to enlarge the immunities of a church precinct to protect granaries, herds, and tools. Sworn adherents turned these norms into binding corporate obligations. Lords and communities alike promised aloud, before relics, to keep the peace, translating the language of fealty into a communal register. The peace and truce movement did not end coercion, yet managed to discipline it into narrow channels that prevented wider harm. Oath cycles created common knowledge about when and where violence was out of bounds, and they anchored rudimentary public enforcement to leagues of lords that pledged to repress violators. The habit of swearing together around fixed texts and formulae is the bridge from ritual to procedure, and from personal bonds to corporate ones. By the mid-12th century, comital Barcelona had pushed a second, complementary response. The Usages de Barcelona lists layers of customs and capitularies, case snippets, and model clauses that regularized how lords and subordinates contracted, how courts took proofs, how injuries were valued, and how the count's ban was to be exercised. It is important to see the Usages as an operating manual for a comital regime that accepted the realities of castle lordship, then recentered authority by naming procedures, persons, and penalties through which that lordship is to be exercised and supervised. Named ordeals and proofs are listed with thresholds and substitutes. Courts announce the order of speaking, schedules of composition fix the price of harm. Violence became computable, just as private retinues were abandoned in favor of named offices. Advocates, vicars, and bailiffs thus act as bearers of formal constraints, what they may take for hospitality, when they must convene, and how far fines belong to the count or to the lord of place. The old customary levies, dues and services long taken by usage, were listed against days and measures to become predictable exactions. If castles proliferating had widened the margins for ad hoc extraction, usages pulled the margins inward by typing claims. The crisis coincided with Catalonia's first sustained Mediterranean turn. Barcelona's port economy thickened, maritime traffic kept multiplying, and craft concentrations in cloth, leather, and metal spread across the coastal plain. Urban councils, still composite and oligarchic, coordinated provisioning, walls, market policing, and dues. The city of Tarragona was refounded, with the lower Ebro cities of Tortosa and Lleida taken as maritime allies. Shifts in the frontier line with the Muslim south generated charters of settlement or carti populationis that swapped labor and military obligations for tenure security and privileges, making for a rural res publica remade by charter. Silver kept flowing just enough to sustain a dinar economy linked to Italian and Languedoc circuits. Maritime ventures spread risk through contract forms familiar across the Western Sea, limited partnerships, profit-share co-ventures, and season-bound freighting. The more Barcelona traded, the more it could pay for policing land and sea routes. The more comital rule codified due process and dues, the more merchants could trust that agreements would be honored, or at least litigable. The same density that made the countryside combustible made the coast solvent. Catalan monasteries and episcopal chapters did for the crisis what they had done for the Carolingian century. They kept the memory of norms. In practice, this meant cartularies and dossiers thick with convenientiae, oaths, acknowledgements of ban, and recorded arbitrations. When comital officers claimed mills, ovens, bridges, or roads as public, they did so by citing monastic records. When lords folded local custom into their own dues, they did so by invoking precedent drawn from those same records. The flood of writing narrowed down interpretive space, armed weaker hands with texts, and trained stronger hands to recognize signatures and seals. The church also remained a material actor. Abbey granaries fed garrisons under agreement, bishops hosted peace meetings and truce assemblies, and ecclesiastical immunities provided the template for urban immunity blocks, streets and markets where comital officers, not local lords, had the right to take and judge. The archive and the precinct together turned moral authority into usable infrastructure. Catalan towns did not yet look like the Lombard communes, but they formed the same institutions in sworn councils, term-limited offices, tax and toll management, and a habit of contracting directly with counts and bishops. Merchants and craft elites bargained for franchises, freedom from certain castle exactions, predictable storage, and set tolls for bridges, and gates secured markets with a roster of approved weights and measures. In border towns and new foundations, these privileges took the explicit form of invitations to come settle with a household and tools. In return, settlers needed to keep watch shifts, serve in armed hosts, and pay a named list of charges. Peasant testimony, whether recorded directly or embedded in litigation, speaks of customs turned to rack. Forced billeting, convoy dues multiplied beyond precedent, demands for hostages or fiance sureties, and invasive jurisdiction by agents of castles and advocates. Later moralists would catalogue the notorious mals usos. Their 12th century genealogy lies in this period's improvisations. Obligations born in emergency that hardened into expectations. The usages and peace texts respond by regularizing demands, declaring how many days, how many carts, how many measures, under whose authority and in which court, with what remedy for abuse. Thus predictability won in place of discretion. Between town and countryside, castle lords reached into nearby fields for cartage, harvest labor, and grinding dues. Towns pulled back with exemptions and ban clauses that called territory into the comital court. The 12th century equilibrium took the form of a mesh. Towns won predictable commercial space, lords retained private jurisdictions, and counts sat above with appellate claims and the right to tax maritime trade. Catalonia saw the crisis happen early thanks to the speed with which comital Barcelona turned improvisation into structure. Personal unions and marriages extended reach without immediate institutional fusion, allowing the count to speak for territories with different customary scripts while gradually harmonizing dues, courts, and coin. Mediterranean alliances traded shares of conquest and booty for naval support, entangling inland lordship with maritime commercial states and drawing Catalan law toward broader merchant practice. Deliberate codification that texts like the usages, charters of peace, or urban franchises to frame comital presence as a guardian of procedure and of the public way, rather than as just another castle claimant. By the mid-12th century, this mix produced something recognizably post-Carolingian in shape. A composite polity whose cohesion depended less on the immediate presence of a peripatetic court and more on a portfolio of codified claims in coin, toll, host, or appellate justice that were mediated through ports, bishops, and cities. Catalonia's lesson for wider Europe was that crisis is not synonymous with collapse. The cage of inherited norms cracked under density with more men under arms, more goods in motion, and more claims in dispute, but the fix was not a simple reversion to command. Instead, oaths turned into leagues, customs into articles, castle force into named office, escort fees and milling duties into listed dues, market hum into counted tolls, and piety into sagras and precincts. What followed was a comital public robust enough to police a seaward regime of trade and settlement, and flexible enough to coexist with lordships that it neither abolished nor fully absorbed. Put simply, Catalonia shows, early and vividly, how privatized compulsion can become public order again when backed by writing, ports, oath communities, and a court that chooses to invest its prestige in procedure rather than in sheer presence. The Mediterranean dividend financed the experiment, the usages and the peace and truce of God bound it, and towns and bishops operationalized it. Out of the disorder came a polity that, while not peaceful or equitable, was at least governable at the scale its economy and society had made inevitable. Across all regions we traced, the same structural pivot repeats with local variation. The system of signs and symbols inherited from the Carolingians, ritualized assemblies, oath chains keyed to persons and places, estate management rendered legible by inventories and lists, had worked tolerably for a sparse world. Between the late 11th and 12th centuries, however, demographic pressure, thicker trade, and more venues of adjudication pushed that system past its limits. Where royal presence thinned or itineraries failed to keep pace, Banus and other powers that once traveled through kingship were asserted in smaller theaters and then stabilized by writing. Jurisdiction hardened into collectible objects, banum, justitia, consuetudo districtus, vice comitatus, that could be granted, split, sold, and sued over. Facilities already central to rural life like mills, ovens, presses, or bridges acquired compulsory use regimes and fee schedules. Towns, fairs, mints, and toll stations became the hinges on which legitimacy moved. Thus congestion happened with too many claimants performing roles for the res publica at once. That congestion ushered new grassroots instruments of coordination. Oaths migrated from elite fidelities to sworn communities and peace leagues. Placeta and inquests multiplied. Cartularies, custumals, and Weistuma turned norms into articles. Urban statutes, franchise lists, and charters of settlement specified days, measures, and procedures. Royal and comital governments experimented with legal markets, safe conducts, and standardized tolls to channel exchange into countable venues. In Champagne, the fairs stitched cloth, coin, and credit into a continental clearing system, even as comital, episcopal and monastic actors fenced banal claims. On the Rhine, episcopal cities and princely towns leaned on oaths and taxes to police river trade, while advocates monetized jurisdiction around monasteries. In Italy, consular communes seized judgment and levy, met an imperial legal offensive with statutes and notaries, and learned to hire an outsider podesta when collegiality failed. In Catalonia, the proliferation of castles and private jurisdictions was normalized by peace and truce oaths, then juridified in the usages, while Barcelona's port finance underwrote a new comital public. In England, castellans and comital administrations filled gaps during the anarchy, and the Angevin settlement later recentered justice and revenue with writ, itinerary, and cash. Everywhere, the fixes favored text, office, venue, and money, techniques that shrink interpretive ambiguity on which opportunism fed on. Violence sat inside this pattern rather than outside it. The source's dark catalogue of siege and wasting, forced carriage and watch, arbitrary protection, dues, hostage, and torture all cluster around castle belts, corridors of trade, and contested shrievalties, precisely where actors were improvising governance. Those harms coexisted with stubborn continuities, with shire courts that still met, borough farms that still cleared, ecclesiastical archives that kept accounts and precedents, urban councils that taxed for walls, bridges, and markets. The crisis thus appears as a long negotiation over who may command, where, and with what schedule, the disputes conducted in courts, at gates, and on parchments. When settlements came, they rarely erased lordship, instead recoding them for new realities. Banalités did not vanish, instead being typed and priced. Earls did not disappear, though their jurisdictions were trimmed and tethered. Communes did not abolish hierarchy, instead engineering rotating offices and fiscal constitutions to survive faction. The larger result is a change in how power becomes legible. Carolingian coordination had rested on presence, memory, and morally saturated forms like oath, penance, and gift, procession backed by estate logistics. The 12th century layered on a procedural skin durable at higher densities. Jurisdiction became an asset class, and the res publica shifted from a royal attribute to a quality of places and procedures. Corporate bodies bound by oath became routine instruments of policing and taxation. Fiscal and legal identities blurred as membership in a town or league entailed duty to pay and defend. Out of overlapping claims emerged a repertoire of generalizable tools: writs and inquests, sworn communes and leagues, podestry and councils, franchise lists and peace ordinances, fee-farms and tallages, legal markets and customs schedules. Later principalities and city-states would adopt them wholesale. In that sense, government emerged as the sediment left by many actors trying to keep life predictable amid crowding. What the crisis changed, then, was not only who ruled but how cooperation was organized. A society that had coordinated through charisma, itinerary, and custom learned to coordinate through category, venue, and account. The same density that multiplied coercion also paid for its disciplining through courts that could sit without a king, through towns that could tax for their own peace, through monasteries that could litigate with archives, through ports that could finance patrols, and through princes who could fund capacity with commuted cash rather than unreliable service. Later absolutisms and liberal polities did not replace a feudal darkness with light, inheriting these 12th century templates and scaled them. The cage of norms did not vanish, was only rebuilt with tighter bars and clearer labels so that a larger, louder world could still move. Across the 12th and early 13th centuries, the techniques invented to cope with crowding, with more people, more transactions, more disputes, and more places where the res publica had to be performed all hardened into procedures, offices, and schedules that made power legible at higher density. The shift began with cutting tallies and closing accounts, drafting forms that channeled complaints to the right forum, numbering entries in books so a superior could check the arithmetic, fixing market days and toll windows, swearing neighbors to testify on fact rather than fight. Out of these small operations, repeated and copied, emerged what contemporaries increasingly recognized as a class of paritae, people who knew, what we would call the earliest inklings of bureaucracy. The documentary turn moved from single proofs, like a charter or a verdict, to serial records like rolls, registers, estimi, and cartularies, enlarged into working archives. Personnel pipelines formed around chanceries, exchequers, episcopal courts, and urban councils, all taking in notaries, clerks, ministerials, sergeants, and jurists. Their value lay less in doctrine than in reliable technique, knowing the steps, the deadlines, the fees, the margins of discretion. Fiscalization converted obligation into money events. Scutage, tie, estimo, ungeld/bead, fee farms and farm tolls, murage, pavage, pontage. Counting cash required assessors, tallies, counterrolls, and audits, so the revenue stream itself paid for the offices that maintained it. Fourth, jurisdictional packaging turned loose claims over bands, districts, and consuetudo into mapped competencies. Sheriffdoms, bailliages and seneschasses, privates, podestery, vegueries, fair jurisdictions, all with the corresponding circuit justice that put calendars and routes under seal. Finally, investigative procedure replaced charismatic spectacle. Inquisitio and sworn neighbors, juries and panels, standard weights and measures, licensed markets under wardens, and registration of debts and contracts allowed judgments to be enforced without the original performers present. Region by region, the institutional developments looked different but worked toward the same end. These intrusions of government were felt in daily life. Measurement was stamped and sealed. Bread, cloth, and coin came under routine assay. The calendar thickened with tax days, fair days, assize days, watch and ward rotations, bridge works, and levy musters. Spaces were sorted with legal markets and fair enclosures, banlieues around towns, immunities for churches and chartered streets, licensed ovens and mills with compulsory use. Names appeared on paper, oath lists, tax rolls, juror panels, debtor registers, and with enrollment came exposure to fee schedules, amercements, and audits. Much of this regulation was locally run, whether by village bylaws, manorial courts, guild officers, or by town councils before princes captured the methods and layered their own officials on top. The experience was cumulative. More decisions traveled through procedure and office. Legitimacy lagged, then adapted. Cities bargained lump sums and policed repartitions, and assemblies set conditions. Theologians and jurists taught when a levy was licit and when refusal was just. Hostility to too many officials became a staple of reform rhetoric, precisely because office had become routine. The crisis era, however, had taught communities and rulers to translate moral claims and customary dues into schedules, forms, and audits that could survive mobility, distance, and dispute. Bureaucracy, in the modest, medieval sense of durable office combined with repeatable procedure, was the sediment left by a century of improvisation at scale. Bureaucracy, in the medieval sense, congealed slowly as repeatable procedures, durable offices, and trained personnel that coalesced out of earlier improvised fixes. The 12th and early 13th centuries are the hinge where ad hoc crisis management, oath leagues, emergency audits, market policing, itinerant judgments, hardened into routines handled by people whose value lay in knowing the steps. Notaries, tally cutters, chamberlains, sergeants, ministerials, podesta staff, bailies and prévots, episcopal proctors, and exchequer clerks didn't invent the state. They made order portable by turning memory into records, presence into schedules, and commands into forms. And I quote, Weber's ideal type of bureaucracy consists of a number of organizational features of administrative order. At the ideal type's core lies a hierarchically structured, professional, rule-bound, impersonal, meritocratic, and disciplined body of public servants who possess a specific set of competencies and who operate outside the sphere of politics. To Weber, modernization and people's corresponding transformed worldviews were preconditions for rational rule, and inevitably led to rational bureaucracy. From Fritz Sager and Christian Rosser, Weberian bureaucracy, Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Politics. Medieval Europe never reached Weber's ideal type, but it did produce professionalized islands inside a still personal political sea. The immediate drivers were practical. More disputes than a lord could hear in person. More cash revenues to count than a household clerk could keep in his head. More trade to police than a single garrison could supervise. Monastic houses and princely households provided the technique bank of stock lists, rental rolls, counter rolls, annual rations, all of which courts and cities then copied. What mattered most was not doctrine but method. How to convene, how to prove, how to assess, how to close an account so a superior could check it. Archives shifted from treasuries of titles to working systems. Cartularies swollen with cross-references. Monasteries already had calendars of receipts and outlays, stock lists, corrody ledgers, while cities had fee books and toll tables, and courts had actor and amercement lists. Copying these methods into princely and communal offices produced a new kind of durability through the continuity of files. The people behind that continuity were the Peritae, a growing professional managerial class whose value lay in knowing the steps, the deadlines, and the margins of discretion. Chanceries learned to channel complaints with the right opening line. Exchequers learned to reconcile tallies and counter-rolls. Notaries stabilized conveyance, credit, and pledge with portable forms, and market officers learned to seal measures and sue violators on a predictable schedule. And I quote, "People in service to those with means and public purposes multiplied from about 1140, and what bore critically on the shift here in view was that their patrons, notables like Archbishop Theobald and King Henry, were close to the new devices of justice and finance, and were disposed to favor educated men, even as they saw no reason to propagate the talents and expertise they nurtured. The patrons were indeed used by secular clerks in quest of ecclesiastical preferments. Their competencies were symptomatic of new and distinct impulses in the exercise of power." From Thomas Bisson, The Crisis of the 12th Century. Alongside the boom in records came the judiciary boom. Canonists, decretalists, and Romanists did not create new sovereignties so much as give every forum from episcopal audiences to fair courts to urban councils a common vocabulary in equity and necessity, proof ladders and appeal ladders, competence rules and case analogies. Practice led doctrine as often as the reverse. Judges delegate, podestas staffs, and royal ducal benches used forms because forms controlled flow. The prestige of Bologna spread through clerks who could make a messy custom look like an orderly file. Conversely, abbey accountants and civic syndics taught princes how to close an account, not just assert a right. In England, the shift is especially visible. The writ system, itinerant justices, and the arithmetic of the exchequer made royal justice, something one did by the steps of summon, essing, default, and amercement, rather than something one hoped for through access and favor. And I quote, "What is distinctive in England is the experience of procedural expertise proliferating obscurely, beyond the exchequer, with only the imperative of utility. Having now to respond as of custom, no longer simply as of grace, Henry, or more usually his justicia or his justices, seeks to manage complaints and petitions, to channel them. And so pressed to respond, they innovate. Declarations or commands are, or more exactly may be, put into writing. The new writs become customary before they become formulaic. Unwritten writing, one might almost say, the innovations of this stage go beyond anything of the sort known to have happened in the monarchies of continental Europe. That this was not accidental is proven by another circumstance peculiar to England, perhaps the most remarkable one of all. The royal outreach for responsible territorial mastery was a working with power by men about the Lord King who came, on the job, to recognize what was happening. From Thomas Bisson, The Crisis of the 12th Century. On the continent, the Capetian drift toward managerial rule condensed around bailies, seneschalks, prévots, inquaitures, and royal registers. These offices and books let a thin court extend itself through procedure more than presence. In particular, and I quote, Philip Augustus had arrived at a mode of domination that was habitually managerial. From Thomas Bisson, The Crisis of the 12th Century. as obligations commuted into money, scutage for service, tallage or estimo for aid, farm tolls and murage for walls. The account became the backbone of intrusion. Assessors, collectors, receivers, chamberlains, treasurers. These are functions conjured by the revenue stream itself. The more frequent and portable the levy, the more the centre needed assessment technologies, hearth lists, sworn inquests, estimi, verification tools, tallies, counter-rolls, audits, and deadlines that could be enforced in court. That logic was not monarchical by nature. Cities used it to deliver lump sums, Paris tie. Fairs used it to allocate fees to wardens. Comital and episcopal houses used it to standardize renders. Princes learned as much from those venues as they imposed upon them. Catalonia shows the same drift emerging out of court practice rather than a standing treasury. Bailiffs' accounts were audited. Courtiers who were also trained scribes wrote up balances, and a recognizable auditing culture formed before specialized ministries existed at all. The professional class here were quite as conversant with the forms for sales, conventions, and pledges as with that for accounts. They employed these in writing up balances of revenues and expenses in audits. And I quote, "The evidence points to an organizing of accountability with a minimum of committed specialization, selling and accounting periodically for local exploitations. A subset of courtier scribes and entrepreneurs functioned so as to perpetuate, if not also to ameliorate, a mode of patrimonial service that, but for its writtenness, and it is a huge exception, may have been widely prevalent in Europe towards 1200. If in 1203, Bishop Wulfger of Passau could have his travel expenses precisely recorded, in accounts of exactly the sort attested for the Count of Barcelona half a century before, who can doubt that his men also accounted for his domains? What Ramon de Colders and his associates got up was an inchoate culture of expertise that persisted under King Pier, only to be disrupted by novel fiscal demands that resulted in enormous borrowing and new taxation. The day of fundraisers had arrived. From Thomas Bisson, the crisis of the 12th century. What made these routines spread was portability. A clerk trained in a chapter school or in Paris or in Bologna could serve in a comital chancery, a royal bench, or a city office. Prevailing forms all used a salutation, narration, petition, command, and they all recorded a party, proof, judgment, and enrollment. Notaries, ministerials, sergeants, and proctors gave rulers and communes a labor market in professional clerical work. Tenure and perquisites helped stabilize behavior, while serial enrollment created an internal memory so that an office outlived its patron. And I quote, "The prevailing dynamic of procedure in all these cases lies in the functional coordination of competencies. What defines these competencies, it becomes clear, is experience as much as skill. Indeed, it would appear that the more menial the task, like those of cutting the tallies or preparing the parchments, the more expertise was required. But great clerks and bureaucrats enjoyed something like tenure in their posts. They held offices in the usual sense of endowed or privileged functions. In England, the imposing dignity and knowledge of the Exchequer owed much to the Lord King's interest and favour, not much to his personal engagement with fiscal technology. They derived from traditions passing from member to member, also from its quasi-genealogical interest in its own antiquities. From Thomas Bisson, the crisis of the 12th century. For the everyday man, the new professionalism was felt less in Latin glosses than in routines that bit. Weights and measures were sealed, cloth bore official stamps, bread was assayed. Fairs ran under watch, roads and bridges fell under by-the-book maintenance. Markets could be legal or not, with dues and witness requirements. Debts and sales were registered so they could be enforced without the original actors present, and names appeared on oath lists, tax rolls, juror panels. Much of this regulation was locally run by village and manorial bylaws, guild officers, wardens, till princes layered their own officers and calendars on top. The intrusion lay in the repeatability, with fewer favours, more fees, fewer one-off placita, more scheduled assizes, fewer charismatic interventions, more steps that could be audited. None of this was an uncomplicated good. New offices multiplied litigations as well as settled them. Standardization sharpened disputes about which standard applied. Registers empowered creditors and rulers. The rhetoric of necessity for the common good drifted toward permanence. The same professional culture that could discipline exaction could also justify it. The same audit that curbed a bailiff could legitimate a taller quota next year. The direction of travel, thus, is legible across regions. From England's writ and exchequer world to the Capetian register state. From Italy's communal chanceries and estimi to Catalonia's vicars and audits. From Rhineland episcopal cities, ungeld, to Paris's repartition tie. Bureaucracy was the residue of many actors solving for predictability in a crowded landscape. And I quote, "There was no need to reimpose Roman imperial order. What Justinian had codified was a massive consensus about right and reason that was destined to prevail in Latin Europe once revived, and towards 1140, diffused. Law, they taught, is something bigger than right. However local, however disjointed the consensus, the repression of violence in later 12th century Europe was, indeed, something like pacification. We see that the crisis marked only the start of government encroachment on citizens and subjects. The path was slow and winding, yet headed in a clear direction. From Thomas Bisson, the crisis of the 12th century. Bureaucracy accreted because denser societies needed transactions to clear and decisions to stick. Its makers were professional because communities and rulers kept hiring the people who could make the procedures work. And nowhere else can its effects be seen today than in taxation. Taxation is the most obvious place to start looking at how things changed. As late as the turn of the 13th century, kings and princes lived on their own, that is, on rents from their personal lands and businesses. The question of what gave these rulers the right to tax, however, had been brewing that century. And I quote, "The only prevailing financial theory in the Middle Ages, and even beyond, stated that the princeps must live off his own, i.e. from revenues generated from his domain relating to ownership of the land, cens, sale of foodstuffs, etc., and to the seigneurial system, banalities, corvée, etc. The role of the princeps, as feudal lord and minister day, was to defend his country and its inhabitants, and to dispense justice, pax et ordo. His sphere of action was limited, and revenues from his domain were sufficient for the exercise of this conservative government. The prince lived within his means. His role was gratuitous, i.e. free, and he could not impose tax on those whom he served. In return, a vassal owed his lord help and counsel, auxilium et concilium. From the Routledge Handbook of Public Taxation in medieval Europe, within that framework, tax in the strict, public sense appeared as a breach of custom, unless anchored in necessity or in the narrow personal obligations of the feudal relationship. The normal template was the auxilium, help to one's lord, sharply circumscribed by custom and tied to people, not territory. Hence the famous 4 reasonable aids. 1. The lord's ransom. 2. His departure on crusade. 3. The knighting of his eldest son. 4. The marriage portion of his eldest daughter. These were episodic, exceptional, and essentially non-permanent by design. And I quote, "Custom limited the financial auxilium owed to the lord to 4 circumstances: paying the lord's ransom, financing his departure on crusade, the cost of knighting his firstborn son, and providing a dowry for his eldest daughter." These 4 events, which were based on custom and therefore legitimized by long-standing tradition, did not require negotiation with his vassals or their consent. This ad hoc, extraordinary assistance was fundamentally personal, in the sense that it related to people, the lord, his son, and daughter. It was not directly associated with defending a space. It was also limited by the fact that 2 of these events, the elevation of his son to the rank of knight and his daughter's marriage, could not be repeated. Seigneurial taxation was not therefore permanent. From the Routledge Handbook of Public Taxation in medieval Europe, thus, domain management mattered more than doctrine. Whether expanding the fisc through escheats, exchanges, market foundations, mint control, and vigilant stewardship looked more legitimate than creating a general levy. When rulers did reach beyond their domains, they typically changed the name of the thing to an aid, a gift, a subsidy, aura of benevolence. They emphasized that the call was extraordinary, bounded in time and purpose, and often mediated by assemblies or local communities. Even urban tie in the 13th century North was framed as a civic contribution delivered in lump sum, repartitioned internally by the city, rather than a naked, top-down imposition. This early doctrine also shaped who was asked and how. Consent ran along the very channels through which rule was performed. Princely councils, regional estates, cathedral chapters, communal councils, guilds. Negotiation was not a constitutional afterthought. It was the operating system. A levy that traveled through these bodies looked like community help for a concrete need, not a standing right to tax. And because it passed through local hands, it carried local restraints. Repartition rules, exemptions, schedules, and forms of redress that blunted the prince's discretion even as they enabled collection. The doctrinal fence around taxation was moral as well as customary. Scholastic commonplaces about lordship as service, and the ruler as minister dei made sustained exaction a sin unless covered by necessity and the common utility. Canonists could tolerate temporary charges for defense or redemption, but they balked at routine levies for princely magnificence. Jurists likewise anchored fiscal legitimacy in the recognized titles of dominium and regalia, along with explicit consent. In practice, this meant rulers leaned hard on other instruments first, like coinage management, toll reorganization, office sales, and credit. They resorted to general taxation only when those avenues were exhausted or when warfare and administration had outgrown the old fiscal base. Because permanence was the red line, medieval princes who edged toward regular revenue often kept the language of exception. They multiplied extraordinary calls, they renewed them, they stretched necessity across years and campaigns, and they bargained charters that conceded form like consultation, purpose clauses, or auditing in exchange for substance, cash. The result, by the late 13th and 14th centuries, was a habit of taxation whose justification still spoke the old dialect of living off one's own, now hedged with clauses about necessity, utility, and consent. That tension between a conservative fiscal ideal and expanding practical demands led to necessity, and the bonum commune being theorized into a standing rationale for public levies, and how specific tax regimes like the Parisian taille or the English tallage, scutage, comital, and urban imposts built the administrative machinery that made those levies bite. By the later 13th century, the old axiom that a ruler should viva de suo, live off his own, had not vanished, but it had been hedged so tightly with the language of necessity and common utility that recurring levies could be justified without admitting they were permanent. The intellectual scaffolding came from two directions. First, the rediscovery of Aristotle and the Roman jurists equipped princes and city councils with a vocabulary of community, koinonia, res publica, equity equitas, and sovereign care, summa potestas, that anchored rulership in the protection of a shared good rather than in mere patrimony. Second, canonists elaborated a moral grammar in which necessitas, originally a narrow excuse for temporary departures from strict law, could be invoked by a princeps providens to secure what was needed to defend the realm, keep order, and administer justice. The move is subtle, not a right to tax because I command, but a duty to levy because I am bound to provide. And I quote, "Several factors played a part in upsetting the financial balance in France in the 13th century and brought the issue of taxation to the fore. The scope of his ars gubernandi was expanding, which led him to seek out the financial means to implement his policy. Cultural expansion and the rediscovery of an extensive body of arguments, both in ancient philosophy and juridical sources, offered the prince a conceptual framework on the basis of his summa potestas. Domain revenues declined, and the remaining option was taxation, but it was restricted to certain feudal situations and was considered sinful. From the Routledge Handbook of Public Taxation in medieval Europe, the Paris schools became the clearinghouse where these strands were tied to practice. Theologians debated whether fiscal power could be squared with a ruler's official function as minister dei. Jurists probed the edges between the right to tax and the right to expropriate, reframing dominion in more public and less proprietary terms. Masters rehearsed a now familiar argument: taxation is licit when 1. Publicly declared necessity exists. 2. The evident utility of the levy can be shown. 3. The form includes consultation, consent, and visible accountability. And 4. The use is constrained to the stated end, whether defense, ransom, or social order. Crucially, necessity was no longer a momentary emergency. Prudence allowed a prudent prince to anticipate necessities, whether the war chests, fortifications, routine policing, and thus to repeat extraordinary collections at regular intervals. And I quote, "The decision to implement a fiscal policy implied defining the taxable group. Should citizens be taxed like in Athens or Rome on the basis of their membership of the community? Or should membership of the community be conditional on paying tax?" Medieval admiration for antiquity prevailed, and members of the community were taxed. Intense thinking about community was fostered in the 13th century by the Aristotelian definition of a koinonia created for good, and Cicero's emphasis on the bonds between the members of a res publica, united in law by consent and connected by communion in matters of utility. Can we therefore deduce that all inhabitants of a kingdom, principality, or town had to support the common good of the res publica? Jurists were more specifically interested in the connection between the right to tax and the right to expropriate, which boiled down to the sensitive issue of the dominion of kings and princes. Theologians, for their part, were interested in the compatibility of fiscal power and the official function. However, these scholars' students were being trained to serve on councils, chancelleries, and lawmaking bodies. In time, scholars gave rulers legitimacy as fiscal masters who could say what made fair use of taxes. Biblical exegetes whitewashed and overlooked the sinful origins of monarchy and royalty. King Saul assuming the throne of Israel. Taxation was now held to be permissible in times of necessity, but even this time of necessity was decoupled from the present time and projected into a foreseeable future. The argument for necessity, focusing on the defense of the realm and war, lifted all temporal and moral impediments as the prince was acting for the so-called common good. From the Routledge Handbook of Public Taxation in Medieval Europe, as doctrine thickened, procedure domesticated power. Assemblies and councils, estates, cortes, town councils, chapters, acknowledged the necessity, bargained the sum, specified the purpose clause, and demanded forms of oversight. Cities especially preferred to deliver a lump sum and repartition it internally, turning tax into a community responsibility system that both enabled central finance and constrained arbitrary exaction. The same theorists who justified levies also scripted resistance. A tax levied sub color iustitiae under pretext of justice, or diverted from its declared purpose, could be refused. In extremis, deposition could be argued. Hence in France, the charters of 1314, 15 bound the crown to evidence of use and emergent necessity, and the Great Ordinance of 1357 linked consent to supervision of receipts and officials. And I quote, "Just as heresies had helped to shape Christian dogma during the Council of Nicaea, so opposition to taxation helped to move fiscal theory forward. Once the conditions for fiscal legitimacy were established, it was to be anticipated that this would enable malcontents to frame their objections. The governed were particularly interested in the form the tax would take and the purpose for which it would be used. The prince was accused of using war as a pretext for levying tax, and then misappropriating it for his own ends, or worse still, committing the country to a war in order to obtain a tax levy sub color iustitiae. The soul of such a prince was in peril of damnation, and he would lose his territory as his subjects would surrender to any foreign prince. Subjects did not have to pay an unfair tax. They could refuse to pay and even depose a prince who refused to revoke it. The theory of taxation also conversely included conditions for just disobedience vis-a-vis princes. In 1314, Philip asserted his right to tax and his intention to levy new subsidies. Leagues of nobles, prelates, and cities were formed in the kingdom and swore an oath of allegiance. Louis was forced to sign charters guaranteeing that the king would not levy any taxes without evidens utilitatis and emergens necessitas. From the Routledge Handbook of Public Taxation in Medieval Europe, the net result before 1400 was not yet the permanent tax of the 15th century ordinances, but a habit of repeated, exceptional levies riding on a mature ideology of necessity. Alternative expedients like debasement, borrowing, or office sales proved either corrosive or insufficient, nudging rulers and communities back to taxes that could be anticipated, audited, and argued. The rhetoric stayed as viva de suo, necessity only, common good foremost, but the practice was cumulative. Regular tithes and aids in France by urban lumps, scutages and tallages in England, hearth and wealth assessments in Italian communes, and clerical tenths negotiated with popes. Across these venues, the professional class allowed taxation to flourish by acting as assessors to value, notaries to enroll, receivers to collect, auditors to close the books. By tying levy to form with purpose clauses, consent rituals, and oversight, scholastic necessity proceduralized taxation, embedding intrusion within rules that subjects could recognize, contest, and when satisfied, obey. Military organization was where the administrative turn bites first and hardest. As obligations were commuted to cash and litigation replaced ordeal, rulers discovered that force itself could be procured by routine, contracted in set units, mustered by roll, paid against a schedule, audited by counterrolls, and supplied by recognizable offices. What had begun as a lord's following call to a rendezvous became a portfolio of service contracts, militia regulations, garrison establishments, and by the 15th century, permanent companies, all with taxation designed to feed them. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, the hosties still mattered, but it ceased to be the backbone of campaigns. Tenured serve waist short, geographically bounded, and unevenly equipped, thus ill-suited to longer operations, sieges, and chevauchés. Lords and tenants thus rendered scutage or money aids. Princes purchased days of service from captains. Towns advanced lump sums to fund garrisons or fleets. In England, the king's military output increasingly came through indentures, bonds with captains to furnish a named number of men-at-arms and archers for a set term and wage. On the continent, chartered embattled escorts, hired routier, and later condotte in Italy did the same work. Contracting reorganized responsibility. A captain was now accountable for the men present at muster, how fit horses were, and whether terms were observed. That accountability could be secured by recognizances and sureties. Defects exposed the captain to deductions or forfeiture. Once service was bought, it had to be verified, hence the explosion of muster rolls and pay rolls. Musterers checked headcounts, equipment, and mounts. Clerks drew up pardons for deserters upon fine. Receivers issued tallies for advances. Auditors reconciled wages with days served. The exchequer or household chamber became a wartime treasury with its own purveyors to buy grain, oats, and cartage, clerks of the stables to count horses, keepers of the wardrobe to issue clothing, tents, and rope. These were not abstract bureau, instead being professionals with the same skills one sees in abbey accounts and town tax lists, but applied to armies. The muster created numbers the law could see, while audits created numbers the treasury could trust. Purveyance, or prize, empowered officers to requisition at tariffed rates. Commissions of array organized county musters and inspected armor. Ports compiled shipping lists for transports and victualling. Receivers general demanded local pre-financing through loans or tallages, redeemable against future exchequer credits. Through all of it, communities became logistical organs. If campaigns made headlines, garrisoning emptied treasuries. Castles, walled towns, and river crossings needed permanent pay lists, magazines, and repair accounts. Governors drew stipends, men-at-arms and crossbowmen drew wages, while masons, carpenters, miners, and smiths drew piece rates. With dozens or hundreds of such sites active in wartime, the court's problem became cash flow and verification. These practices fostered standardized garrison establishments with so many lances, so many archers, and so many crossbowmen to keep track of. Auditors or lieutenants made regular visits to certify strength and condition. Town councils and abbeys often co-financed or provisioned nearby garrisons, documenting deliveries so they could claim remissions or privileges later. Siege operations added specialized trades like sappers, carpenters, or engineers, and petty contracts for ladders, mantellits, or eventually gunpowder, all of which had to be written, priced, and checked. The 12th and 13th centuries did not erase mounted elites, but they foregrounded packaged infantry and specialists. Crossbowmen, pike formations, and longbow companies became purchasable blocks. Italian communes pioneered condotte, written service contracts stipulating term, pay, equipment, captains' obligations, arbitration, and penalties, with notaries as the indispensable glue. In the Holy Roman Empire and along the Rhine, cities fielded civic contingents under statutes that governed watch and ward, turnout, and fines. Everywhere, we see the same move from diffuse personal duty to named units under rules, and therefore to records. Mercenaries like routiers, Brabantsons, or Almogavers would later become predators on the countryside. Their predation spoke to a fiscal truth that men hired for cash must be paid regularly or they will pay themselves. These occurrences pushed rulers toward more predictable revenue, more frequent audits, and in France especially, toward making the taille a war tax that could become, in time, a peace tax. Gunpowder did not create bureaucracy, but it did demand it. By the 1430s, 1460s, effective field artillery required permanent workshops, skilled founders, powder mills, transport gear, and trained crews on wages. Central arsenals issued guns on inventories. Officers kept returns. Powder and shot were rationed by caliber. France's later 15th century reforms, often associated with the Bureau brothers, exemplify the step change. Standardized pieces, a permanent train, and ordnance officers to manage it. Venice's earlier arsenal shows the same principle from a different polity: concentration of skill, serial production, and a payroll-backed labor force. Artillery's appetite for money and method upped the premium on steady taxation and central supply. France's crown still proclaimed the ban and arrière ban, the summons of subordinates, but by the mid-15th century, its effective core was paid companies. The Ordinance of 1439 linked military reform to fiscal permanence by tying the tie to standing needs. The Ordinance of 1445 created compagnies d'ordonnance, nominally 15 companies of 100 lances each, a lance being a team of a man-at-arms, castellans, mounted archers, and pages. The Ordinance of 1448 organized Frank archers, a militia complement drawn from the peasantry who were granted tax relief in exchange for periodic training and mobilization, together with a centralized artillery train and provincial treasurers to pay the troops. These steps produced a permanent cadre on continuous pay, garrisoned and inspectable, scalable in war by calling out militia and hiring auxiliaries. England did not emerge from the 100 Years' War with a comparable standing army, but it did with a standing method. The indenture system of captains under bond, musters and audits, wages and purveyance proved portable across campaigns. Commissions of array codified militia musters. The statutes of Winchester and later reforms on arms and watch kept a domestic framework for calling out men and checking equipment. The realm also maintained permanent garrisons, most visibly at Calais, and learned to anchor expeditionary forces on staple ports, victualling contracts, and wardrobe finance. Thus, instead of a large paid force in peacetime, England built a highly professionalized contracting and audit mobilization scheme ready to scale when required. Beyond monarchies, cities and regional leagues built their own military bureaucracies. Italian communes fielded armies from estimate-based assessments and condotte, reported by Camera treasurers to council Swiss and South German towns, managed banners and matricular quotas. Catalan and Aragonese polities coordinated Vigiria musters with bailiff audits. Iberian frontier warfare wove military orders like those of Santiago or Calatrava into a fiscal and administrative fabric of rents, privileges, and Almajarafazgo's customs. In each case, military regularity rose on fiscal and record regularity. Who owes, in what unit, with which equipment, for how long, at what pay, verified by whom. By the mid-15th century, the standing army in Western Europe meant a permanent kernel of paid, organized troops under named offices, sustained by permanent taxes and ordnance establishments. France crystallized the model first, then Burgundy emulated with its own ordnance companies. The Iberian crowns moved toward continuous frontier garrisons and royal guards, while Italian states combined condotta cycles with growing state arsenals and fiscal offices. Even where no peacetime host stood under arms as in England, the standing administration of war through indentures, musters, audits, garrisons, and purveyancer remained in place. Thus in warfare, what changed was the organizational substrate that made armies and force predictable. Contracts and musters replaced casual summons. Garrisons with pay lists replaced episodic billets. Artillery with inventories replaced improvised engines. Finally, named and calendared taxes replaced occasional aids. One gleans the effects up close, and personal officers at your gate measuring grain, clerks at your market sealing measures, muster commissioners in your field counting heads, receivers in your town demanding the lump sum you promised your prince. The standing army is but the visible tip. Beneath it lies the paperwork that made war continuous. Across 13th century England, enclosure first emerged in a dense field of law, bylaws, and collective action. The legal frame crystallized early. In 1236, the Provisions Statute of Merton answered baronial complaints that small enfeefments protected by common rights blocked improvement of wastes, woods, and pastures. Henceforth, justices were to allow enclosure so long as free tenants were left sufficient pasture for their tenements, with ingress and egress preserved. Heirs after 1236 still brim with enclosure suits. At Shropshire in 1250, plaintiffs prevailed in a notable share of cases, while others failed on technicalities or lack of rights. Lords themselves kept lobbying, leading to the Second Statute of Westminster, 1285, which extended the same sufficient pasture principle against neighbours as well as tenants. And I quote, "Some of the enclosures were indeed made by landholders for their own profit. More often the maker of the enclosures was a tenant or group of tenants. The landholders' motives in allying with their tenants were presumably to gain rents from the new fields, holdings, and buildings which were being developed. They also had a wider interest, by showing themselves to be good lords who looked after their tenants. In fact, landholders often had a rather weak control in these pastoral and woodland landscapes. Sometimes they promoted new settlement and enclosure by renting out parcels. But one suspects that the initiative often came from the tenants, and the lords were willing to accept the changes as long as their superiority was acknowledged and the rents paid. These disputes involved a degree of competition between peasant and peasant over the use of land. From Christopher Dyer, Conflict in the Landscape, the enclosure movement in England, 1220 to 1349. On the ground, enclosure disputes were energetic and surprisingly legalistic. Eyre rolls from Warwickshire in 1221 and Northamptonshire around 1202 and 1203 capture familiar patterns of banks raised, hedges set, complaints of disseason, and courts ordering fences removed. The settings are telling. Woodland edge Arden Villes, where a sarting and piecemeal closes sat beside shared pasture. Protests often crossed Ville boundaries when intercommoning made rights hard to pin down. Men, and occasionally women householders, came from rings of neighbouring townships to break a hedge or open a ditch, precisely where no single lord could dictate rules. Where a single manors court and customary bylaws existed, disputes were easier to settle. Where pastures lay, horn under horn, among several villes, villagers convened bin-law meetings to bargain rules, but frictions endured. And I quote, These bylaws emphasize the degree to which agricultural practice was directed and controlled by an assembly of cultivators, the manorial court, who coordinated and regulated the season-by-season activities of the whole community. Arable and meadowland were normally thrown open for common pasturing by the stock of all the commoners after harvest and in fallow times, and this necessitated some rules about cropping, fencing, and grazing beasts. Similarly, all the cultivators of the intermixed strips enjoyed common pasturage in the waste, and in addition, the rights to gather timber, peat, and other commodities were essential concomitants of the possession of arable and meadow shares. From Susan Buck, no tragedy on the commons. Crucially, direct action itself was bounded by law and often restrained. Bracton allowed immediate abatement, tearing down an unlawful bank or hedge if done at once. Juries could still fine offenders or award damages, and most rioters targeted only the disputed obstacle, not embarking on wider destruction. Villagers feared precedents. Even small encroachments, if unchallenged, might snowball into lost grazing, so communities risked penalties to defend a line. Many quarrels stretched over years, moving from hedge breaking to compromises, confirmations of pasture, or money compensation. Understanding the geography behind enclosure conflicts helps explain both conflict and regulation. Mixed landscapes, woodland margins, heaths, commons laced with crofts and closes, generated recurring boundary frictions. Customs required that closes be thrown open after harvest, and in fallow years. Intercommoning and seasonal sharing multiplied the need for detailed bylaws. Pre-conquest boundary clauses already combined shared spaces with enclosed plots, foreshadowing the later 13th century pattern of negotiated openness and periodic closure. From Milan's customs to Rudolph of Habsburg's 1291 ruling, authorities regularly balanced enclosure with the community's share. The very push to make the most of land sharpened collective notions of common property, prompting more explicit rules, not less. In England, too, Merton's sufficient pasture codified an accommodation between improvement and communal rights rather than erasing the latter. The record supports a nuanced view of 13th century intrusions of governance at village level. Lords enclosed, and tenants often did too, but outcomes were channeled by manorial courts, by inter-village assemblies, and by the king's courts policing novel disseisin and nuisance. The commons endured where communities mobilized law and custom. Enclosure advanced where litigants proved sufficiency, negotiated compensations, or regularized new arrangements in bylaws. It is precisely the proliferation of small, local rules that made England's communal landscapes both productive and intensely regulated long before the later, more infamous waves of enclosure in early modern times.